The carriage came to a sudden stop. Daniel Mercer opened his eyes and saw wet snow through the fogged-up window. His body still wasn't quite responding as it should. 2 days ago, he'd woken up in someone else's skin. A 60-year-old baron had died right at the table. A royal decree lay before him. Exile to the border. To Dam Fortress. 5 widows to deal with. The old man couldn't take it. But Dan Crow could. He always could. 12 years in the minefields had taught him one simple thing. Look first. Then think. Then act. Panic kills faster than any charge. He stepped out of the carriage and immediately looked down. The cobblestones in front of the gate were chipped. Cracks fanned out from the right-hand corner. The gate had sagged a finger's width toward the hinges. The ground had shifted. Not a curse. Physics. He raised his gaze to the walls. Black soot covered the stone halfway up. The left tower stood at a 2-finger angle from the vertical. The moat was overgrown with weeds and frozen to the bottom. On the eastern side, the trace of an old tunnel was visible, haphazardly filled in. 3 years old, maybe 4. Dan scanned the line of the wall and mentally marked each point. 4 places where the stone held. 2 where it hung by a thread. 1 where, with a good battering ram, the whole thing would collapse inward in a minute. 5 women stood by the gate. Dark cloaks. Silence. They'd been brought here earlier. Like luggage. Like part of the punishment. 5 widows of officers who'd fallen in the latest border massacre. Not a single nobleman in the capital was willing to take responsibility for them. The king had solved the problem elegantly. He'd handed them over along with the fortress. Formally an act of mercy. In reality, a death sentence with a stay of execution. Dan took off his hat. Wet snow settled on his hair. The hair was not his own. Dark. Without a trace of gray. When he had awakened in this body 2 days ago, it had been that of an old man. And then something happened. As if his soul had shaken out the foreign shell. His back straightened. The gray hair was gone. The servants crossed themselves and stepped back. The baron they knew was dead. The man in his body was someone else. Dan looked at the women. The one standing in front was tall, broad-shouldered, with a strand of gray hair at her temple and a sword at her belt. She looked at him as if he were just another problem she'd have to solve. The second was small and quick, a griffin behind her ear, sharp eyes, calculating. The third stood slightly behind the others, blonde hair, hands folded in front of her, calm. Too calm for someone who'd been brought to a place of certain doom. The fourth stood apart, a cold smile, back straight, an aristocrat to the tips of her fingers. She looked at the fortress as if it were an insult. The fifth was the youngest, a heavy gaze, silence, hands accustomed to work. Dan addressed them matter-of-factly, without any grandstanding. He said his name was Everett Mercer. He said he knew. They'd been brought here against their will. He'd come here against his own. So they were on equal footing. Inside it was cold, dark, and, by all accounts, dangerous. He would go in first. Whoever wanted to follow him could. He would understand who didn't. But it would be worse outside. The tall one with the sword snorted briefly. The fair-haired one raised an eyebrow. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked toward the gate. As he walked, he counted his steps. Corners. Lines of sight from the walls. A habit. For 12 years, he'd been entering places that normal people fled from. The difference was that before, he'd been looking for other people's explosives. Now he had to gather everything from scratch. The gate creaked open with the rasp of rusty metal. The courtyard greeted him with desolation. A well in the center. A collapsed shed on the left. A barracks with a caved-in roof on the right. People were sitting by the far wall. 20 of them. The garrison. Written-off soldiers who'd been sent here to die quietly. They looked at him without interest. Without hope. The way one looks at yet another boss who's come for a week and will head back. Or would die. One of them stood up. The oldest. His face was weather-beaten. His eyes were cloudy. He introduced himself as Sergeant Griff. He said the garrison was at his disposal. His voice was hollow. Dan nodded. He asked about water. Griff said the well was poisoned. A curse. 3 years. Anyone who drank from it died. They hauled water from a stream 2 hours' walk away. Dan looked at the well. He walked over. He leaned in. The smell. Copper and stagnant water. He knew that smell. Not a curse. Copper sulfate. Someone had dumped a bag of poison into the well and blocked the spring. An old trick. In his world, that's how village wells were poisoned in conflict zones. Dan straightened up. He told Griff he needed a rope, a torch, and 2 hours. Griff looked at him as if he were crazy, but he brought the rope. Dan tied it around himself, lit the torch, and climbed down. The well was 12 meters deep. The walls were slippery. The torch hissed from the moisture. At the bottom, he found what he was looking for: gray-green clumps of caked copper sulfate, and a rusty, wrought iron plug hammered into the crevice from which the spring was supposed to flow. Someone had done this on purpose, professionally. They'd plugged the spring and poisoned the water. 3 years ago. 3 garrisons had died because of it. Not from a curse. From a man with a shovel and a sack of poison. Dan knocked out the plug. The spring hit him in the face with an icy jet. He climbed back up, wet and dirty. He dumped a handful of copper sulfate lumps and the rusty tube onto the rocks. He explained briefly. No curse. Someone had dumped a sack of copper sulfate here 3 years ago and plugged the spring with a wrought iron stopper. The spring had shifted course. The water had become stagnant. The curse was the man with the shovel. The courtyard fell silent. Griff stared at the lumps of copper sulfate and couldn't close his mouth. Dan didn't wait for them to digest the news. He ordered them to bring charcoal, river sand from the frozen ditch, clay from the old stove in the barracks. By midnight, he'd assembled the filter, an ugly column of 3 layers. Charcoal, sand, clay. Primitive, but it worked. The water passed through the filter and came out clean, odorless, tasteless, just water. He poured the first mug and handed it to Griff. The sergeant took it, looked at it, sniffed it, drank it. His face twitched. He didn't say anything. He just nodded. And for the first time all day, he looked at Mercer as if he were a living person. 5 women were standing at the entrance to the courtyard. They'd been watching the whole time. Fair-haired Celeste stepped forward. Silently, she scooped up some water with her mug. She tasted it and said very quietly that it was just water. Her voice trembled. Not from the cold. Dan stood by his ugly filter. Wet, dirty, tired. And for the first time in 2 days in this strange world, he felt something familiar. The sensation after defusing a bomb. When the charge is removed, the wires are cut, people are alive. You can breathe out. For a second. Before the next one. He looked at the fortress, at the black walls, at the crooked tower, at the holes in the roof, at the 20 soldiers who didn't believe they'd live to see spring, at the 5 women who'd been brought here like unwanted furniture. All of it was one big minefield, and he was going to clear it, piece by piece, stone by stone, just as he was used to, just as he knew how, just as he'd done his whole life. There was only one difference. Before, after work, he'd return to base, but now the base was here, and there were no other options. The morning began with the cold. Dan woke up in the former commandant's room on a stone bench covered with a rotten hide. The window was boarded up. An icy wind blew through the cracks. He sat up. His body ached from yesterday's descent into the well, but his body obeyed him. That still surprised him. 2 days ago, it had been that of an old man. Now he looked about 40. Strong, muscular, a scar on his chin, a different face, different hands, but the same head. The head of Dan Crow, Senior Sergeant of the Engineering Corps. And that head was already making a list. First, the gate. Sagging by a hair's breadth. With a good blow from a battering ram, it'll fly off its hinges in 3 strikes. Second, the eastern wall. The tunnel is poorly backfilled. If Waldorn sends out a reconnaissance party and they find this tunnel, an assault from the east will take half an hour. Third, the barracks roof. Collapsed in 2 places. 20 men are sleeping out in the open in the wet snow. Fourth, food. He didn't yet know how much food they had. Fifth, people. 20 soldiers without a commander. 5 women without a home. The priest Griff had told him about yesterday. The cook who had tried to escape on foot 3 times. And himself. A man with a foreign name and a foreign title. Dan stood up. He went out into the courtyard. It was still dark. The wet snow had stopped. The air smelled of stone and dampness. Someone was already standing by the well, a small woman with a slate tucked behind her ear. Hana Shin. She was drawing water from his filter and counting something. Her lips moved silently. Dan approached. She didn't turn around. Without looking up, she said that the filter produced 3 buckets an hour. For 26 people, that's 4 buckets a day for drinking, 2 for cooking, 1 for the infirmary, if there is one. That makes 7. A little over 2 hours of filter operation. She'd already done the math. Dan stopped. He looked at her. For the first time in 2 days in this world, he'd met someone who could do math. He asked what else she'd calculated. Hana turned around. Her eyes were piercing, wary. But behind that wariness lay something else. Hunger. Not physical. The hunger of a person who hadn't been listened to in a long time. She said she'd counted the supplies in the pantry while he'd been working on the well that night. Enough grain for 3 weeks. Salted meat for 2. Firewood for 10 days if they used it sparingly. Candles for 5 days. After that, darkness. Dan nodded. He asked if she had anything to write with. Hannah pulled a stylus from behind her ear and a crumpled sheet of paper from the folds of her cloak. She always carried them with her, a habit. Her husband had been a quartermaster. She kept his books. All 15 years of their service. Dan took the stylus from her. He turned over the royal decree of exile he'd been carrying in his pocket. On the back he began to sketch. A plan of the courtyard, the layout of the walls, lines of sight from the towers. He marked the weak spots. A tunnel from the east, the sagging gate, the tilt of the left tower, holes in the roof. Kana watched. She said nothing. Then she said he drew just like her husband, only better. Dan didn't answer that. He asked where the storeroom was. She led him there. The storeroom was in the basement beneath the barracks. Cold. Damp. Sacks of grain stood directly on the stone floor. Half of them were damp. Salted meat hung on hooks. Some of it already smelled off. Firewood was piled in a corner. Damp. Dan walked around. He counted. Hannah was right. 3 weeks' worth of grain. But only if the damp sacks were still usable. He opened one. The grain inside had started to sprout. Not good for bread, but good for porridge if cooked today. He told Hana that the damp grain needed to be used right away. Today and tomorrow. After that, it'll rot. She nodded. She wrote it down. He left the storeroom and went to inspect the fortress. Methodically, as was his habit. Step by step. Wall by wall. Stone by stone. The eastern wall was in worse shape than he'd thought. The tunnel dug from the outside had been filled with earth and rubble, but from the inside, the wall had cracked from the foundation to halfway up. It would crumble on impact. Dan crouched down. He felt the stone. The mortar between the blocks had crumbled away, but the blocks themselves were intact. Heavy. Good stone. Whoever built this fortress knew what they were doing. The problem wasn't with the construction. The problem was that no one had repaired it in 3 years. He walked around the entire perimeter of the wall. The north side was holding up. So was the west side. The south side faced a cliff, and the wall was thinner there. They were counting on natural protection. That made sense if the cliff didn't crumble. Dan looked down. The cliff was steep, 30 meters. Below was a river, frozen over in winter, but swelling in the spring. That was both good and bad. Good because you couldn't approach from the south. Bad because if the river eroded the bank, the southern wall would collapse along with half the fortress. He mentally added that to the list. By noon, he had finished his inspection. He returned to the courtyard. He sat down on a rock by the well. He spread out the decree with the blueprint in front of him. And he began to think. He knew how to think. It was the only thing he had left from his past life. Not strength, not magic, not a title. A mind that could see stress points, weak spots, lines of destruction, and the lines along which things could be rebuilt. A priest approached him. Father Bernat, thin, nervous, shifty eyes. He said he wanted to speak with the Baron. Dan said he was listening. Bernat spoke cautiously. He said he'd seen the Baron going down into the well last night. He said it was unwise. The well is cursed. The spirits of the depths have poisoned the water. The fact that the Baron found some stones means nothing. The curse could return. People shouldn't drink that water. Dan looked at him. calmly. He said the curse was called copper sulfate. He showed a rusty plug that he'd pulled out of the spring. He said the spirits of the depths used wrought iron and knew exactly where to strike to cut off the flow. Very knowledgeable spirits. Bernat turned pale, not from fear but from anger. He wasn't used to being contradicted. For 3 years, he had been the sole authority in the fortress, the only one who explained why everything was bad. A curse, spirits, sin. Convenient explanations. They required no work, only prayers. Dan didn't argue with him. He said he respected his ministry, but the water would be clean, and people would drink it. Bernat walked away. His back was straight. His hands were clenched. Dan realized he'd made his first enemy within the walls. It was to be expected. In every minefield, there's someone who doesn't want the mines cleared, because as long as the mines are there, he's needed. He tells people where not to go. He's important. But once the mines are cleared, he's just a priest in a crumbling chapel. Later that afternoon, Dan gathered everyone in the courtyard. 20 soldiers, 5 women, the priest, the cook, 2 servants who had stayed with the baron from the capital. He stood before them. He spoke simply. He said that the fortress was in poor condition, but not beyond repair. 3/4 of the walls were intact. The stone was sound. There was water. Enough food for 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, 4 things needed to be done. Repair the gate. Seal the crack in the eastern wall. Fix the roof of the barracks. Find a source of firewood within a 2-hour walk. He spoke briefly, without fanfare, as if giving a briefing before a Sapper operation. Here's the task. Here are the deadlines. Here's what needs to be done. Griff listened, his face stony. Then he asked who would do the work. He had 20 men. Half of them were sick. A third were drunk. The rest didn't believe they'd live to see spring. Dan said he'd start himself. Tomorrow morning, at the gate. He needed 2 men. The rest could watch. Or help. He didn't give orders. He showed them how. Margot Asher stood to the side, listening. Her arms crossed over her chest. When everyone had dispersed, she walked over. She said he spoke beautifully. She asked if he knew how to do what he said, or if he was just all talk. Dan looked at her, at the sword on her belt, at the gray strand of hair, at the scars on her knuckles. He said she'd see tomorrow. Margot snorted. She said she'd be watching, and if he turned out to be just another windbag, she'd take her sword and leave through the pass, alone. Dan said that if he turned out to be a blabbermouth, she'd be right. Margot looked at him strangely. She nodded. She left. That evening, Dan sat in the commandant's office, finishing up his plan by the light of a candle stub. His hands moved. The stylus scraped across the paper, and images flashed through his mind. The bridge, the river, the smell of gunpowder, a shout over the radio, a flash. It happened every time he started thinking like a sapper. Every time his brain switched to calculations and diagrams, his past life reminded him of itself. It wouldn't let him forget. He closed his eyes, waited it out, opened them, continued drawing. He'd gotten used to working through it, through the pain, through the memory, through the flash that had once been the last thing he saw. The difference was that before, after the flash, there was darkness. But now, after the flash, there was wet snow and a stranger's face in a murky mirror, and a fortress he had to rebuild. At dawn, Dan stood by the gate with a crowbar in his hands. He'd found the crowbar in the smithy. The smithy was cold. The forge hadn't been stoked in months, but the tools were still in their places. Someone had once kept this smithy in order. Dan chose his tools: a sledgehammer, 2 wedges, and a rope. That would be enough to start with. The gate had sagged because the right hinge had come out of its socket. The socket had crumbled away. The stone around it had cracked from the water that had frozen and thawed over the years. Ice works better than any battering ram. It's just slower. Dan examined the hinge. The iron was rusty but sturdy. Forged. Old work. Good work. The problem wasn't the hinge. The problem was the stone around it. He began chipping away at the crumbling mortar. Methodically, blow after blow. The crowbar rang out in the frosty air. 2 soldiers stood nearby. Griff had sent them. Not to help, just to watch. Dan paid them no mind. He worked. An hour later, he had chipped away all the old mortar around the socket. The stones were exposed. Clean, smooth. Now he needed new mortar. He turned to the soldiers. He asked if there was any lime in the fortress. They exchanged glances. One said there were sacks of something white in the basement. Maybe lime. Maybe not. Dan went to check. Lime. Unslaked. 4 sacks. Someone had brought them in and forgotten about them, or hadn't had time to use them. He dragged 1 sack out into the courtyard. He found an old trough. He poured in some water. He began to slake the lime. When the mixture hissed and a cloud of steam billowed out, 2 soldiers stepped back. One crossed himself. Dan smirked. He told them not to be afraid. It wasn't witchcraft. It's chemistry. Stone and water. They didn't understand the words, but they saw that the Baron was standing in a cloud of steam and wasn't afraid. That worked better than any explanation. By noon, the mortar was ready. Dan mixed it with sand from the ditch. He began pouring it into the nest. He worked with his hands, pressing the mortar into the cracks and smoothing it out. He set the debt. When the sun passed its zenith, the right hinge sat in the socket like a glove. He called over 3 soldiers. The 4 of them leaned on the gate leaf. The gate stood straight. For the first time in years, it closed without a creak and without a gap wide enough to fit a hand between the leaves. Dan stepped back. He looked at it. The gate was old, made of oak, reinforced with iron strips. Heavy. A master craftsman had once made it. Now it was working again. Margot stood by the wall. She'd been watching since morning. Arms crossed, silent. When the gate closed smoothly, she walked over. She looked at the hinge, at the mortar, at the wedges. She said it was fine. He wasn't one to talk much. Then she asked what was next. Dan said the next thing was the wall, the eastern one, a crack running from the foundation. If it wasn't patched before the first serious frost, the ice will tear it all the way to the top, and the wall will collapse. Margot nodded. She said she had 5 soldiers who were still able to work. Not all 20, but 5. She'd bring them tomorrow. Dan looked at her. He said thank you. Margot grimaced. She said there was no need to thank her. She wasn't doing this for him. She was doing it because if the wall collapsed, she'd die under the rubble, and she didn't like dying under rubble. She preferred to die standing up, with a sword. Dan nodded. He didn't argue. The reason didn't matter. The result did. That evening, he ate at the communal table. For the first time all together. 20 soldiers, 5 women. The cook had prepared porridge from damp grain, thick, unsalted. Dan ate and watched the people. The soldiers ate in silence, quickly, the habit of hungry people. Hannah ate and counted. Her lips moved. She was counting the portions. How much grain had been used? How much was left? Celeste ate slowly, neatly, calmly. Then she stood up and went over to one of the soldiers who had been coughing since morning. She placed her hand on his forehead. She checked on him. She returned. She said nothing. But Dan saw. She was already at work. No requests, no orders. Isabel sat apart. She ate with the tip of her spoon. Her face was disdainful. The porridge was beneath her dignity. The fortress was beneath her dignity. Everything around her was beneath her dignity. But she ate, because she was hungry. Una sat in the corner, silently. She ate quickly, without looking up. She left immediately after eating. Dan noticed that she headed toward the smithy. After dinner, Hannah approached him. She said she had done the math. If grain consumption remained at the current rate, in 18 days they would start starving. They needed a source of supplies. The surrounding villages, hunting, trade, something. Dan asked what she knew about the villages. Hannah said that on the way here, they'd passed 2. Both looked deserted, but smoke was coming from the chimneys. So there are people. They're hiding. They're afraid. Dan nodded. He said that in 2 days, when he was done with the wall, he'd go to the village to talk. Hannah looked at him. She said he shouldn't go alone. No one knows him. They might mistake him for a tax collector, or worse. Dan asked what could be worse than a tax collector. Hannah said without a smile, a tax collector with soldiers. Dan thought for a moment. He said he'd go with Margot, just the 2 of them, no soldiers. Hannah said that wasn't a good idea either. The locals would see a woman with a sword and a man with a nobleman's collar. They'd assume they'd come to take something. Dan asked what she suggested. Hannah said she'd go herself, alone, without a sword, without a collar, with a sack of grain. A small one, a gift, a gesture of goodwill. She's small. Not scary. A woman. They'll open the door for her faster than they would for a baron with a swordswoman. Dan looked at her. He said it was dangerous. Hannah raised an eyebrow. She said everything here was dangerous, and that for 15 years she'd marched with the army through territory where supply trains were robbed every other week. She knows how to talk to people who have no reason to trust. Dan was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. He said he'd give her 2 days. Hannah nodded and left. Just as she reached the doorway, she turned around. She said she'd take a sack of grain from the damp ones. They'd be thrown out anyway, and they'd do just fine as a gift. Dan smirked. She even considered that a gesture of generosity. That night he went down to the basement, not to the storeroom. Deeper. Griff had mentioned that there were passages beneath the fortress. Old ones. Collapsed. Sounds could be heard coming from there at night. The soldiers talked about creatures from the depths. Dan grabbed a torch and headed down. The staircase led into the darkness. The steps were made of stone. Wide. Built to last for centuries. This wasn't a basement staircase. It was an entrance. Somewhere. He descended 2 flights. The walls were different. The stone was smoother. The masonry was tighter. A different hand. A different era. The one who built the upper part of the fortress and the one who built the lower part were different people, separated by centuries. On the 3rd flight, he heard a sound. A grinding. Metal against stone. Rhythmic. Not a creature. A mechanism. Something was moving below. Something man-made. Dan stopped. The torch crackled. The air was warm, warmer than up above. That meant only one thing. There was a heat source down there. Geothermal, or man-made. He made a mental note of it. He didn't go any deeper, not now. First, the gate, the wall, food, people. And then he'd go down and find out what kind of mechanism was grinding in the darkness beneath the fortress that had been considered cursed for 3 years. He went back upstairs. He closed the door to the basement behind him and mentally added one more item to his list. The strangest one. The most interesting one. The one that didn't smell of lime or copper sulfate. The one that smelled of mystery. For 3 days, Dan worked on the eastern wall. Margot brought 5 people. She hadn't lied. 5 of them were able to handle the tools. The other 15 couldn't. But of those 15, 3 more showed up on their own the second day. They stood silently nearby, took what they were given, started hauling stones. Dan didn't ask why. He knew why. They saw the gate. They saw that the gate was closing, that the water was clear, that someone was doing something. Not talking, just doing. For soldiers who had lived for 3 years in a decaying fortress without a commander and without hope, this meant more than any speech. The eastern wall required a different approach. The crack ran from the foundation. You couldn't just fill it with mortar. It would crack again at the first frost. Dan sat in front of the wall for an hour. He looked, he thought, then he began to draw on the ground with a stick. The soldiers watched. Margot stood nearby. He explained as he went along, not for them, for himself. It was a habit. At Sapper school, they'd taught him to think aloud. It reduces mistakes. He said the wall had cracked because the foundation beneath it had subsided on the east side. The tunnel dug 3 years ago had loosened the soil. Water seeped into the loose soil. It froze. It expanded. It pushed the soil out. The foundation sank downward. The wall followed suit. The solution is simple. Don't repair the crack. Repair the foundation. Dig a trench along the wall down to the base. Remove the loose soil. Pack in stone and pour concrete. Once the foundation is back in place, the wall will stop spreading. Then you can seal the crack. Margot asked how long it would take. Dan said 5 days if the weather didn't turn bad. Margot said the weather would turn bad. This is the border. The weather always turns bad here. Dan said 7 days then. They started digging. The frozen soil was hard to break through. The pickaxes clanged. Their hands were freezing. Dan worked alongside everyone else. A pickaxe in his hands. A shovel. Carrying soil in a basket. He didn't give orders from behind. He stood waist-deep in the trench and struck the frozen ground with his pickaxe. The soldiers saw. They didn't comment, but they worked faster. On the second day of digging, Una came to the trench. Silently. She stood there. She watched them work. Then she approached Dan. She said there was iron in the smithy, old, but usable. She asked if he needed staples for the wall. Dan stopped. He looked at her. He asked if she knew how to make staples. Una said she'd grown up in a blacksmith shop. Her father was a gunsmith. She'd been forging since she was 12. Dan said he needed staples an elbow's length long, P-shaped, to drive into the stone on both sides of the crack and pull it together. Una nodded and walked away. By evening, smoke rose from the forge, for the first time in months. The sound of a hammer striking an anvil echoed through the fortress, rhythmic, heavy, and full of life. The soldiers looked up and listened. The forge was working. That meant the fortress was alive. By morning, Una had brought 6 staples. Straight. Neat. Dan took one. He turned it over in his hand. He looked at Una. He said the workshop had done a good job. Una didn't smile. But her shoulders straightened slightly. Meanwhile, Hannah had ridden off to the village. Alone. On the only horse left in the stable. With a sack of damp grain strapped across the saddle. Dan watched her ride away through the gate, which now closed smoothly. Margot stood nearby. She said that a small woman traveling alone on the road in the border zone was a bad idea. Dan said he knew. Margot asked why he'd let her go. Dan said because she was right. They'd open the door for her faster. Margot snorted. She said that if she got killed, it would be his fault. Dan said he knew that too. Hannah returned 2 days later, alive, with an empty bag, and with news. The village was called Bryn, 18 households. There used to be 40. Half were burned down last year. A raid. Not Waldorn. Bandits. Deserters from the collapsed garrison of some neighboring fortress. People were hiding. They were afraid of everyone. When Hannah arrived alone with a sack of grain and no weapons, they didn't open the gate for a long time. Then they opened the gate. She gave them the grain. She talked to them. She told them that there's a new baron in Ravenhold, that he's fixed the water supply and the gates, that he doesn't collect taxes, that he needs food and is willing to pay for it, or trade for it. The village elder, a man named Tom Wheeler, listened in silence. Then he said they had turnips, and goats, and a little barley, but no iron, not a single knife, not a single axe in working condition. The bandits had taken everything. Hannah said the baron had a smithy and a blacksmith. Wheeler looked at her for a long time. He said that if the baron sent them 3 axes and 5 knives, he would send the baron a cartload of turnips and 2 goats. Hannah brought this proposal to Mercer. Dan listened. He turned to Una. He asked if she could forge 3 axes and 5 knives. Una said she could. In 2 days, if there was coal for the forge. Dan nodded. He turned to Hannah. He said the deal was accepted. For the first time in days, Hannah smiled slightly. Not warmly, sharply, like someone who had solved a problem. Dan. Dan recognized that expression. He used to smile like that himself when he diffused a charge and it didn't explode. On the 4th day of work on the wall, what he'd been waiting for happened. Isabel Courtright came out of her room. She'd hardly left it at all during the first few days. She'd been sitting upstairs in the tower she'd taken for herself, the only tower with an intact roof. She read. She wrote. She spoke to no one except Celeste, and even then only briefly. But on the 4th day, she came down into the courtyard. She approached Dan. He was standing in the trench, dirty and covered in lime stains. She stood above him, clean, wearing a fur cape. She said she wanted to talk. Dan said he was listening. Isabel said she knew who was behind Baron Mercer's exile. Not the king. The king signed it. But it wasn't his idea. The idea came from Lord Kastner, the first counselor, the very man who was a relative of her late husband. She knows because she saw the letters. And she knows that Kastner didn't just want to remove Mercer from court. Kastner wanted Ravenhold to remain empty. Specifically this fortress, this very place. Not just any border. This one specifically. Dan climbed out of the trench. He sat on the edge. He looked at Isabel. He asked why she was telling him this. Isabel paused. Then she said that she had come here intending to write to Kastner at the first opportunity and tell him what the new baron was up to. That would have been her safety net, her ticket back to the capital. But over the course of 4 days, She saw something she hadn't expected. She saw a man who repairs the gate with his own hands, who sleeps on a rock, who eats the same porridge as the soldiers, who hasn't ordered any of the 5 women to share his bed, who listens when people speak to him. She said she didn't know who he really was, because the man she knew as Baron Mercer didn't behave that way. But she decided to wait, to see, and to tell him about Kastner. Because if Kastner wants this fortress to be empty, it means there's something valuable inside. And she wants to know what it is. Dan looked at her. He was thinking about the tunnels, about the warm air, about the mechanism that creaked in the darkness, about the fact that someone had poisoned the well on purpose. He said she was right. There was something valuable in the fortress. He didn't know what yet, but he would find out. And when he did, she would be the first person he told, because he needed her brain. Isabel raised an eyebrow. She asked what exactly for. Dan said it was for letters to the capital, because without her, half his letters would read like a cry for help. He had enough decorations and walls as it was. Isabel froze. Then for a second, something new appeared on her face. Not a smile, not warmth. Surprise. Genuine surprise. She was used to being a decoration. Her husband treated her like an ornament. The court saw her as an ornament. A surname, a face, dresses. And this dirty man from the trench had just said he needed her mind. Not her body, not her surname, her mind. She nodded. She said she would draft a letter to the king, without a cry for help, with the right words. She turned and walked away, back straight, light step, different. Dan watched her go. He wiped his hands on his pants, crawled back into the trench. The wall wouldn't repair itself. On the 7th day, the crack in the eastern wall was sealed. 6 of Una's staples held the stone across the fracture. The new foundation, filled with mortar, had set in the frost. The wall was holding. Dan stood in front of it and looked at it. He placed his palm on the stone, cold, hard, alive. The wall was a wall again, not a ruin. He turned around. 8 soldiers were standing behind him. Not 5, 8. 3 more had arrived over the past few days. Griff stood among them. For the first time. The sergeant had been watching from around the corner for 4 days. On the 5th day, he picked up a pickaxe. On the 6th, he hauled 2 buckets of mortar without waiting to be asked. Today he stood nearby, looking at the wall they had repaired together. His face was stony, but his eyes were different. Not clouded. Dan nodded at him. Griff nodded back. Not a word. No need. Now the roof. The barracks were a long building against the western wall. The roof had caved in 2 places. The rafters had rotted. The beams had snapped under the weight of the snow. 20 men slept beneath the holes, covered with whatever they could find. Every morning there was a layer of snow on the blankets. Every morning, 3 or 4 of them coughed worse than the day before. Celeste went from one to the next. She felt their foreheads. She gave them herbal teas made from whatever she found in the surrounding area. There weren't many herbs. Winter, snow, but she found them. She knew where to look. 15 years with the regiment had taught her to find medicine where there was none. Dan came to her that morning. She was sitting by the fire in the corner of the barracks. In front of her, on a spread-out rag, lay bundles of dried herbs. 3 kinds. She was sorting through them carefully, separating them by type. Her hands didn't stop for a second. They were always doing something. He sat down beside her. He asked how many patients there were. Celeste said 7. 3 in critical condition. Their colds had turned into pneumonia. Without warmth and dry air, 2 of them wouldn't make it through the week. Her voice was steady. No panic, just a statement of fact. She was used to counting the casualties. Dan asked what she needed. Celeste looked up. She looked at him, quietly, intently. She said she needed warmth, dry air, clean water, and alcohol. For disinfection. Warmth and dryness, that's the roof. There's clean water, no alcohol. Dan nodded. He stood up. He said the roof would be ready in 3 days. He'd figure out the alcohol. Celeste watched his back. She didn't say anything. The roof required wood. There wasn't much wood in the fortress. The old rafters had rotted. New beams were needed, long ones, sturdy ones. The forest began a half-hour's walk to the north. But cutting down trees by hand without proper axes would take a long time. Una had forged 3 axes for the village of Bryn. Dan asked her to forge 2 more for the fortress. Una nodded. By evening, the axes were ready. The next morning, Dan took 4 soldiers and went into the forest. Margot went with them, not to chop wood, but to provide protection. She walked ahead, her sword at her belt, her eyes on the trees, on the tracks, on the horizon. She moved like someone accustomed to ambushes. Dan noticed this. He noticed how she chose her position, how she checked the blind spots. She was a good soldier, a very good one. In the forest, they found what they needed. Straight pine trees, not old, not young, just right for beams. Dan chose 4 trees. He showed them where to cut. He explained how to fell them so the trunk wouldn't split. The soldiers listened. Margot listened too. Then she said he cut down trees the same way he fought, by plan. Dan said that a plan was the only thing that distinguished work from chaos. They cut down 4 trees. They trimmed the branches. They dragged them to the fortress. It was hard, slow, wet snow under their feet. But they got them there. In the courtyard, Dan began marking out the beams, a plane in his hands. Una stood nearby and watched him work with the wood. Then she asked where he'd learned to do that. Dan said in the army. Una looked at him. She said that Baron Mercer had never served in the army. He'd been a marshal at court. That's not the army. It's politics in uniform. Dan was silent for a moment. He said that war teaches you quickly. Una didn't argue, but her gaze grew more attentive. She'd noticed something. Something that didn't quite add up. She kept quiet for the time being. But she remembered. It took 2 days to finish the roof. Dan worked up there. On the rafters. The height didn't scare him. Something else did. Every time he climbed up high and looked down, an image flashed through his mind. A bridge. A river. Piers. A secondary charge hidden under the concrete. A flash. A scream over the radio. He stood on a beam and waited it out. He closed his eyes. Counted to 10. Opened them. He kept going. Margot saw it. She stood below, looking up. She saw how he froze for a second, how he closed his eyes, how he then carried on. She didn't say anything, but she saw it. The roof was sealed. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't even, but it was tight. Snow no longer fell on the sleeping people. On their first night under a complete roof, the soldiers slept quietly. No one coughed. No, they did cough, but less. The dry air and the heat from the stove, which was no longer warming the street through the holes, began to take effect. Celeste walked among the cots, checking on them. In the morning she went to Dan. She said the 2 in critical condition were stable, no worse, so they'd live. Her voice was the same as ever, steady, but there was something in her eyes. She looked up at the ceiling, at the new beams, at the fresh wood smelling of resin, and quietly said, "Thank you." Dan said, "You're welcome. It's just a roof." Celeste shook her head. She said that for someone who's freezing, it's not just a roof. It's life. She knows that. For 15 years, she'd watched people die from things that could have been fixed. And for 15 years, she couldn't do anything about it because there was no one to fix them. Dan looked at her. At her hands, which were always busy with something. At her calm face, behind which steel was hidden. He wanted to say something. He didn't get the chance. There was a knock at the fortress gate. Griff opened it. A wagon stood on the road. A horse. And an old man. Tom Wheeler from the village of Bryn. He'd brought turnips. 2 sacks. And a goat. 1. Not 2. 1. The other had died on the way. He apologized. Said the road was bad. Dan went out to meet him. Said that 1 goat was already plenty. He thanked him. Wheeler looked at the fortress, at the gate, which stood straight, at the wall, without a single crack, at the smoke rising from the smithy and the barracks. He said quietly that he hadn't seen smoke rising from Ravenhold in a long time. People in Bryn say the Baron is a sorcerer, that he lifted the curse from the fortress. Dan said he wasn't a sorcerer. He just knew how to work with his hands. Wheeler shook his head. He said it was all the same. On the border, a man who knows how to work with his hands is a sorcerer. Then he said something else. He lowered his voice. He said that people had come over the pass. Not soldiers. Scouts. 3 of them. A week ago. They asked about the fortress, about the garrison, about water. Wheeler told them the fortress was empty, that there was no water, that there were only dead bodies there. They believed him. They went back over the pass. But they'll be back. Dan listened. His face was calm. Inside, he was doing the math. Waldorn's scouts. They'd already been here. A week ago. So they know about the fort. They know it was empty. Wheeler lied to them. That's a gift. But it's a one-time gift. When they return and see smoke coming from the chimneys and the gate still in place, they'll realize someone has settled here, and they'll report it. Dan thanked Wheeler. He asked if he could be warned if the scouts showed up again. Wheeler looked at him. He said he could, if the Baron sent a blacksmith to the village to repair a plow. Just one plow. That's all he's asking for. Dan nodded. He said he'd send one. Wheeler rode off. Dan stood by the gate and watched the wagon drive away. Margot stood beside him. She whispered that here it begins. Dan nodded. Waldorn is already looking this way. We have a roof. We have water. The gate stands. The wall holds. We have 3 weeks' worth of food, plus turnips. There's iron in the smithy. 8 able-bodied soldiers. 5 women, each of whom is worth 5 men. And beyond the pass lies an entire kingdom that will march through these mountains in 6 months. Dan turned around. He walked into the courtyard. As he walked, he told Margot that he needed her plan for defending the pass, how she envisioned it. Margot stopped. She looked at him. She said that no one had ever asked her opinion on defense. Dan didn't turn around. He said that he was asking. She had commanded the garrison. She knows what an assault looks like. He knows how to prevent an assault from happening. They need both parts. Margot caught up with him. For the first time, she walked beside him, not behind him, not to the side, beside him, and she began to speak about the pass, about the narrow choke point 3 hours' walk to the east, about how it could be blocked, about where the archers should be positioned. Dan listened. He walked. He listened. And in his mind, the blueprint of the fortress began to expand. Walls, a moat, gates, and now the pass as well. The gorge, the choke point, a line of defense that didn't begin at the walls of Ravenhold, but 3 hours' walk before it. He smiled. For the first time since he'd been in this world. Not a joyful smile, a professional one. The kind of smile a sapper would give when he saw the blueprint, when he understood where to place, where to remove them, where to set them so that whoever advanced would never reach their goal. Margot led him to the pass the next day. A 3-hour walk along a rocky trail. The wind whipped their faces. Snow blew horizontally. Margot walked ahead, confidently. She knew this path. She'd walked it when she served in Drakemont. Drakemont lay to the south, also on the border. It, too, had fallen. But Margot remembered every rock on every mountain path her soldiers had ever set foot on. The pass was called Wolf's Throat. The name was apt. A narrow passage between 2 rock walls, 300 meters long, 4 paces wide at its narrowest point. 2 horsemen couldn't pass side by side. A single wagon could make it through. Dan stood at the entrance to the pass and watched. His eyes scanned the scene. His mind calculated. The walls to the right and left rose to the height of a 5-story building. The rock was layered, slate. Fragile if you knew where to strike it. Sturdy if left untouched. Archers could be stationed on the upper ledges. 10 crossbowmen up there, and the gorge becomes a corridor of death. No infantry could get through. But Dan wasn't thinking about archers. He was thinking of something else. He walked inside. Slowly, counting his steps. His hand on the wall. His fingers read the stone. Cracks, layers, inclusions. On the 100th step, he stopped. Right here. The wall on the right had a diagonal crack, running from top to bottom, a natural one. Water and ice had been working on it for centuries. If he widened the crack, removed the key blocks holding up the upper part, and set up a prop, a temporary one that could be knocked out with a single blow, then the entire upper section of the right wall would collapse inward into the gorge. 300 metric tons of rock, maybe 500. It would block the passage from wall to a height of 2 human heights. An army that enters the gorge before the collapse would find itself trapped in a stone bag. An army that doesn't enter would find itself facing a wall of stone that would take a week to break through. Dan turned to Margot. She said he was smiling, and that smile made her uneasy. Dan said he didn't see a passage here. He saw a trap. Margot looked at the walls, at the crack, at the stone. She didn't see what he saw. She saw a position for battle. He saw a plan for destruction. Different perspectives. Both are needed. He explained, briefly. If we remove a few stones from the right wall and set up a prop, we can bring the wall down when we need to. Margot listened, her face stony.
Then she said that this wasn't a battle. It was a massacre.
Dan nodded. He said yes, exactly. She asked if it repulsed him. Dan was silent for a moment. Then he said it did. But the people who would come through that pass would come to kill his people, his soldiers, his women, the children who might by then be sleeping in the barracks under the roof he himself had thatched. It repulsed him, but he would do it. Margot looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. She said that in that case, she was with him, according to regulations. They returned to the fortress by evening. Dan sat down to draw. He drew until midnight, a defense plan for the pass. 3 echelons. First, a decoy camp 2 hours march from the pass's entrance. Campfires, tents, footprints. Enemy reconnaissance will find it and report that the forward post is here. They'll waste time and energy on an empty spot. Second, the pass's throat. Crossbowmen from above, a rockfall on command, a stone bag. Third, if anyone breaks through the pass's throat, a minefield. Not mines as he understands them. There aren't many pits or gunpowder here, but traps, tripwires, camouflaged pits with stakes, false trails leading to dead ends under fire, a classic echeloned defense. 3 lines, each slows them down, each kills, each buys time for the next. He showed Margot the blueprint that morning. She looked at it for a long time, traced her finger along the lines, asked questions. How many men were in the forward positions? How to retreat after a collapse? What if the wind blew dust into their own ranks? Dan answered every single question, without irritation. She asked the right questions, things he might have overlooked because he was thinking like an engineer, while she was thinking like a soldier who would be manning those positions. They needed both perspectives. By the 3rd week, the fortress had changed. Dan stood on the wall and looked down at the courtyard. The gates were closing. The walls were holding. The roof was intact. The well provided clean water. Smoke rose from the smithy. The barracks were warm. Of the 20 soldiers, 12 were on their feet. 3 were still sick but were recovering under Celeste's care. 5 were beyond hope, not sick, broken, drunkenness, apathy. 3 years of rotting away in a forgotten fortress had killed something inside them that couldn't be fixed with mortar and staples. Dan didn't pressure them. He didn't punish them. He simply worked alongside them every day and waited. On the 4th day, one of the 5 stood up and silently picked up a shovel. 4 remained. Maybe they'll get up. Maybe not. He couldn't fix them all. Hannah kept track of everything. She started a ledger. A real one. She found the commandant's old record books in the basement. Empty. The former commandant hadn't bothered to keep records. Hannah filled page after page. Grain consumption, firewood consumption, water supply, iron supply, number of arrows, number of serviceable weapons, number of people capable of wielding them. Every evening she came to Dan with a report. He listened. He asked questions. She answered precisely, without unnecessary words, without emotion. Numbers, facts, decisions. Once, after a report, he told her that if the army listened to people like her, they wouldn't lose wars. Hannah froze. The stylus in her hand stopped moving. She looked at him. For a long time. Then she lowered her eyes. She said quietly that her husband had said the same thing, but no one listened to him. And when they didn't listen, they blamed him for the numbers not adding up. Because it's easier to blame the one who does the math than to admit that the one in command is incompetent. She stood up. She left. That night, she removed the mourning ribbon from her wrist. Dan saw it in the morning. He didn't say anything. There was no need. Toward the end of the 3rd week, the first guest arrived from the capital. Not a merchant, not a soldier, an official, a royal inspector, a man named Tobias Rent, plump, smiling, with a letter signed by some secretary to some minister. He had come to inspect the condition of the fortress and report back to the capital. That's what he said. Isabel pulled Dan aside before the meeting. She put it bluntly. Rent works for Kastner, not for the king. He was sent to see if the Baron was still alive and wasn't doing anything to interfere with their plans. Dan nodded. He went out to meet Rent. He smiled. He showed him the fortress, the gate, the wall, the barracks, the well. Rent smiled. He took notes. He nodded. He said he was impressed,
That he'd report the Baron was settling in.
that he'd wish him success. Dan led him through the courtyard. He showed him everything in plain sight. And he didn't show anything that was hidden. He didn't show the blueprints. He didn't show the defense plan for the pass. He didn't show the entrance to the dungeons. He didn't mention the tunnels. Rent left 2 hours later, satisfied, with a notebook full of notes. Isabel stood by the tower window and watched his carriage drive away. Dan went up to her. He asked what Rent would write. Isabel said he would write the truth, that the Baron was alive, that the fortress is inhabited, that Mercer is repairing the walls and gates, that nothing dangerous is happening. A minor nobleman is busy with a minor matter, not worth paying attention to. Dan asked if that was good or bad. Isabel said it was good, for now. Kastner will calm down. He'll decide that Mercer is broken and is fiddling with stones out of desperation. That will buy some time. But if Kastner finds out about the dungeons, or that the fortress is becoming something more than just a ruin with a garrison, then it won't be inspectors who come.
Then people with different kinds of letters will come.
Dan nodded. Time. He needed time. Time was the only resource he'd always lacked. On the bridge, he'd been 30 seconds short. Here, he needed months. He went down into the courtyard. He looked at the fortress. At the people moving about the courtyard. Griff was assigning tasks. Margot was training 4 soldiers with swords in the courtyard. Una was hammering away in the smithy. Hannah was carrying a notebook from the storeroom. Celeste was hanging herbs on a rope under the awning. Isabel stood at the tower window writing a letter. Each was in her place. Each was doing her part. Not because he had ordered it, but because there was now a purpose. He wiped his hands, took the torch, and headed for the door to the basement. It was time to go deeper. He descended alone, the torch in his left hand, his right hand on the wall. His fingers read the stone. He already knew the first level, the staircase, 2 flights, different masonry, a different era, warm air rising from below, the creak of a mechanism. The staircase ended at the 3rd flight, a corridor, wide, high ceiling. 2 people could walk side by side without having to duck. The floor was level, not trampled earth, hewn stone. The slabs were laid fit together without gaps. Dan crouched down. He ran his finger along the joint. Perfect. Work like this required a tool he hadn't seen here, and knowledge that wasn't available here. He walked down the corridor, slowly, step by step, counting. On the 20th step, the air became noticeably warmer. On the 40th, a sound appeared. That very same grinding noise. Closer, rhythmic, metal against stone, or stone against stone, once every 3 seconds, like clockwork. On the 60th step, the corridor led him into a hall, round, 15 meters across. The ceiling was lost in the darkness. The torch illuminated only the lower part of the walls. And what was on the walls made him stop. Black blueprints, carved into the stone, not drawings, not decorations. Engineering blueprints, with dimensions, with a scale, with symbols in a language he didn't know but whose logic he understood. Because it was engineering logic, universal. Arrows indicated the direction of flow, of water. Circles with dots marked load points. Lines with notches indicated dimensions. He stepped closer. He held his torch up. The first drawing was an aqueduct, a system of canals, underground, fed by a mountain spring, with distribution points, with storage chambers, with filters. Dan stared, unable to believe his eyes. It was a water supply system, well thought out, complex, designed to supply not a fortress, but a city. The second drawing was a ventilation system, channels in the walls, draft created by temperature differences. Warm air rises from below and draws fresh air through the side shafts. That's where the heat in the tunnels comes from. Not magic. A geothermal source deep underground. And an engineering system that distributed this heat throughout the entire underground network. He didn't understand the third blueprint right away. Some kind of structure, levers, counterweights, chains. Then it dawned on him. A hoisting mechanism, an elevator. for lifting stone and ore from the lower levels. That's what was creaking. Somewhere deep underground, this mechanism was still operating centuries after it was built. Stone by stone, lever by lever, eternal, powered by water from an underground river. Dan stood in the middle of the hall and slowly turned around. Wall after wall. Blueprint after blueprint. Bridges, shafts, aqueducts, support structures, load calculations. Everything carved in stone, everything preserved. Whoever built this knew exactly what he knew. Strength of materials, hydraulics, thermodynamics. Not in the same terms, not with the same notation, but the same essence, the same laws, the same principles. The first kingdom, the one that vanished centuries ago. It wasn't backward, it was advanced. Engineering-wise, at a level the present world has not yet reached. And someone destroyed it. Someone wiped that knowledge off the face of the earth. And someone kept Ravenhold empty so that no one would come down here and read what was carved on the walls. Isabel was right. Kastner wanted the fortress to remain dead. Not because of the border, not because of Waldorn, because of this. Dan walked along the wall, slowly, memorizing. Not all the blueprints, that would take days, but the key ones. The water supply, the ventilation system, the mechanism. And one more blueprint he found in a niche by the far wall. Separate from the rest, as if it had been hidden. It was a map of the tunnels. The entire network. 3 levels. The top one where he was standing. The middle one where 2 passages led from the hall. And the lower level, deep down, near the underground river. The network was enormous. The tunnels radiated out from the fortress for kilometers, toward the pass, toward the valley, toward the mountains. Whoever controlled these tunnels controlled the entire border, not from above but from below, unseen. He memorized the locations of the key points, the exits to the surface, intersections, storage chambers, and something else. One passage was marked on the map that led neither to the pass nor to the valley. It led east, toward the capital, a long, straight line, an underground road. Someone, at some point, could have traveled from Ravenhold to the outskirts of the capital underground. That's why Kastner kept the fortress abandoned. Not because he feared the knowledge on the walls, because he feared the road that made the border and the capital neighbors. That nullified the entire geography upon which power was built. Dan returned to the hall. He stood there. He thought. Then he did what he always did before a serious operation. He made a plan. Don't dig any deeper. Not yet. Don't tell everyone. Not yet. Tell Isabel. She'll understand the politics. Tell Hannah. She'll figure out what can be gained from this. Don't tell Margot. Not because he doesn't trust her, because Margot is a soldier. She'll want to take action, and it's too early to act. Don't tell Bernat. The priest is already an enemy within the walls. If he finds out about the tunnels, he'll run to the nearest inspector. Dan went upstairs. He closed the door. He stepped out into the courtyard. Morning. Cold. Clear. The first snow-free morning in 3 weeks. He found Isabel in the tower. He told her, briefly, the blueprints, tunnels, the road to the capital, Kastner. Isabel listened. Her expression didn't change. Only her fingers gripped the quill a little tighter. When he finished, she was silent for a minute. Then she said she understood now. Mercer isn't a punishment for Kastner. Mercer is a threat. A living person in a place that should be dead. Kastner doesn't just want to remove the Baron from court. Kastner wants to ensure that no one, ever, finds out that beneath this fortress lies the key to the kingdom's entire political system. Dan asked what she suggested. Isabel thought for a moment. She said nothing for now. Keep quiet, gather strength, fortify the fortress from above, and to explore the dungeons quietly, step by step, without witnesses. When they knew enough, then they could decide what to do with that knowledge. Dan agreed. He asked about the letter to the king. Isabel took a sheet of paper out of her desk drawer and handed it to him. Dan read it. The letter was perfect, respectful, modest. Not a word of complaint, not a word of request. Just a report. The fortress is inhabited. The garrison is in place. The border is under surveillance. Baron Mercer thanks His Majesty for his trust. Between the lines, something else was clear. I am alive. I am working. I am not broken. And I remember. Dan looked at Isabel. He said that without her input, this letter would have sounded like a cry for help. Isabel allowed herself the faintest of smiles. She said that was her job. He nodded. He left. He stopped on the stairs. He remembered something. He came back. He said that at dinner that evening, he wanted her to sit next to him. Not because he needed company, but because he needed someone who could see people. Someone who could read faces.
Someone who noticed what he missed.
Isabel raised an eyebrow. She asked if he was suggesting she spy on him from his own table. Dan said no. He was asking her to be his eyes. Isabel was silent for a moment. Then she nodded. She said she would. And for the first time, she didn't call him Baron or Mercer. She called him by his name. Everett. Her voice sounded different then. Not cold, not sarcastic. Just the voice of a woman who had spoken the name of a man she was beginning to trust. A month. 30 days in the fortress. Dan stood on the wall and was counting. Not stones. People. The courtyard was noisy. Noisier than it had been 3 weeks ago. 2 men had arrived from Bryn. The Wheeler brothers, the elder sons. Tom Wheeler had sent them to work. Not for pay. For protection. Bandits had reappeared on the roads. 2 farms in Bryn had been robbed. Livestock had been stolen. Wheeler decided it was safer to stay near the Baron, who had walls and soldiers, than in a village without a fence. The brothers knew how to lay stone. Bricklayers. A rarity. Dan put them to work on the outer wall. Facing. Filling in the small cracks he'd noted during his initial inspection.
They worked in silence.
Quickly. Well. Village hands. Accustomed to stone. 3 days after the brothers arrived, a family came. A husband, a wife, and 3 children. From a village beyond the pass. The village had been burned down. Waldorn intelligence had passed through it on their way back and set the barn on fire. Not out of malice. As a signal. We were here. We'll be back. The family had walked for 2 days through the snow. The youngest child was 4 years old. He didn't cry. He'd stopped crying. Dan took them in, without asking. He gave them a room in the barracks. Celeste examined the children. The youngest had a cold. The middle child was silent and wouldn't let go of her mother. The oldest, a 12-year-old boy, looked up at Mercer and asked if he could help. Dan said yes. He put him to work carrying water to the filter. The boy worked all day. In the evening, he ate at the communal table and smiled for the first time in a week. Hannah took inventory. With 3 new mouths to feed, expenses had gone up. But so had income. The Wheeler brothers had brought a sack of barley and a barrel of salted fish with them. A gift from their G. The balance held. For now, Dan solved the firewood problem. Not by chopping wood, by using coal. 2 hours north, on a mountainside, he found an outcrop of coal. Exposed. Shallow. The coal lay right beneath a layer of soil. Just dig and take it. No one had taken it, because no one knew it was fuel. In this world, they knew only charcoal. They didn't use coal. They considered it useless rock. Dan knew better. Coal burns hotter and longer. 1 cartload of coal replaces 3 cartloads of firewood. He took 4 soldiers. They set off in a cart. In 1 day, they dug up a full load. They brought it back. Dan showed them how to light it. The coal smoked. It stank. The soldiers grimaced. But the heat from the coal stove was such that the barracks became warm for the first time all winter. Firewood consumption dropped by 2/3. Una saw the coal and her eyes lit up. She understood before the others did. Coal in the forge meant a different temperature, different iron, a different quality. She told Mercer that if she had this coal, she'd be able to forge more than just knives and staples. She'd be able to forge steel, real steel. Dan nodded. He said there'd be as much coal as she needed. That evening, Una stayed in the forge until late at night. Dan walked by. He peeked in. She was standing by the forge. The fire lit up her face. Her hands were covered in soot. Her hair was pulled back. She was forging something small. Not a weapon. Not a tool. A component. A part of a mechanism. He asked what it was. She said it was a spring-loaded lock. for a crossbow trigger mechanism. She'd come up with a new design. Lighter, more accurate, faster to reload. Dan stepped closer. He looked at it. He picked up the part. He turned it over in his hands. He understood how it worked. He said it was good work. Very good. Una didn't smile, but she looked him straight in the eye. For the first time without looking away. She asked where he'd seen mechanisms like that before. Because he'd picked up the part and immediately understood what it was. And Baron Mercer had never been interested in mechanics. Dan paused. He said that war teaches you to notice things. Una shook her head. She said that war teaches you to kill. Something else teaches you to notice things. She didn't say what. She turned away toward the forge. She continued her work. Dan left. He stopped on the stairs.
She was the second person after Isabel to sense that he wasn't who he claimed to be. Isabel had figured it out through politics. Una realized it through her craft. Both remained silent. For now. A week later, Waldorn's scouts returned. This time, not 3, 7. And not quietly. They passed through Bryn. Wheeler sent his eldest son to warn them. The boy ran up in the middle of the night, gasping for breath. He said that 7 horsemen with weapons were standing in the village, asking about the fortress, about the Baron, about the garrison. Dan roused Margot. She got dressed in a minute, sword at her belt, her face composed. She asked how many. Dan said 7. Reconnaissance, not an assault. Margot nodded. She said that reconnaissance that never returns is the best kind. Dan shook his head. He said no. Reconnaissance that returns and tells you what you want it to tell you, that's the best kind. Margot raised an eyebrow. He explained. The 7 will return and report what they saw. If they see a strong fortress, Valdorn will prepare a large army. If they see a weak fortress, Valdorn will send a small detachment. A small detachment is easier to destroy. So we need to show them weakness.
Margot didn't agree right away. She was a soldier. Soldiers show strength. A sapper shows what's needed. They argued for 10 minutes. Then Margot nodded. She said, all right. His war. His rules. In the morning, Dan ordered the forge fire to be extinguished. Remove the repaired items from the yard. Leave only the old and broken ones in plain sight. He ordered the soldiers to look the way they used to. Sloppy. Dejected. Griff understood immediately. He smirked. He told his men to remember how they'd looked a month ago. That came easily to them. Waldorn scouts arrived around noon. 7 on horseback. They stopped at the gate. They didn't enter. They watched. Dan went out to meet them. Alone. Unarmed. In an old cloak. Hunching over. He feigned exhaustion. He wasn't acting. He recalled how Baron Mercer had moved before his arrival. An old man. Broken. Exiled. The senior scout asked who he was. Dan said he was Baron Mercer, Commandant of Ravenhold. The scout looked at the fortress, at the walls, at the gates. Dan prayed that he wouldn't scrutinize the hinges, the fresh mortar, the brackets on the eastern wall. The scout didn't scrutinize them.
He saw what he expected to see.
Ruins. An old man. 24 ragged men. A place that could be taken by a single company. He asked how many men the Baron had. Dan said 15. He lied, rounding down. The scout nodded. He turned his horse around. He rode off. The 7 of them headed back toward the pass. Margot was standing outside the gates. When Dan returned to the courtyard, she said she didn't like hiding. Dan said he didn't either. But he liked being alive even more. Margot snorted. She said you couldn't argue with that. The second month began with snow. Real snow. Not wet. Dry. Prickly. The blizzard raged for 3 days. The wind howled through the gorge. The temperature dropped. Dan walked around the fortress, counting the heat. The barracks held up. The coal stoves were working. But the rooms in the towers were drafty. Cracks in the walls. Windows without shutters. Corridors like wind tunnels. The heat from the stoves escaped up the chimney along with the smoke. He knew how to fix it. In his world, every village stove builder knew this. A chimney with a bend. A simple thing. The smoke goes up the chimney, but not in a straight line. In a zigzag,
Through brick partitions inside the chimney.
each bend is a wall that heats up from the smoke and radiates heat into the room. The smoke is the same. The draft is the same. But half the heat that used to escape outside now stays inside. Dan started with the barracks. He took apart the chimney. The soldiers watched in horror. Winter, a blizzard, and the Baron was dismantling the only stove. Griff walked over. He asked quietly what he was doing. Dan said he was making it so it would be warmer, using the same amount of firewood. Griff looked at the dismantled chimney. At the bricks Dan was laying out in a zigzag pattern. He didn't say anything, but he stayed nearby. He handed Dan the bricks, silently. By evening, the first stove had been rebuilt. Dan lit the fire. Smoke began to rise. The draft was working. Within an hour, it was hotter in the barracks than it had ever been in the 3 years since the garrison had been established. The soldiers sat against the walls, unable to believe it. One took off his boots, for the first time in a week. His feet had been blue from the cold. Now they were turning pink. Griff stood by the stove. He held his hand over the bricks. The bricks were hot. Before, the chimney had been cold. All the heat had escaped upward. Now the heat was here, in the walls of the chimney. He turned to Mercer. He said one word. How? Dan explained it using his fingers. Smoke goes up. If you put up a partition, the smoke turns. It goes sideways, then up again. Every turn is a hot wall. The more turns, the more heat stays inside. Griff listened. He nodded. Then he said that the Baron was either a sorcerer or the smartest man he'd met in 30 years of service. Dan said he was neither. He'd just seen how it was done. He didn't sleep that night, or the next. He walked around the fortress, taking apart and reassembling the stoves, one after another. The barracks, the kitchen, Celesta's room, where the wounded and sick children lay, Isabel's tower, Yuna's smithy, Hana's storeroom. He took each stove apart and put it back together. His hands were black with soot. His eyes were red from smoke and sleeplessness. By morning of the second day, all the stoves had been rebuilt. Coal consumption had been cut in half. It was hot in the barracks. It had gotten so warm in Celesta's room that she took off her shawl. There lay 2 wounded soldiers and 3 children from a refugee family. The youngest, a 4-year-old boy, was sleeping without curling up into a ball for the first time in a week. He was stretched out. His fists were unclenched. His face was calm, warm. Celeste stood over him and watched. Then she went out into the courtyard. It was early morning. The sky was gray. The blizzard had died down. The first light was breaking through the clouds. Mercer was sitting on a frozen stone by the well. His hands were black with soot. His head was bowed. His eyes were closed. He was sleeping while sitting up. He hadn't built himself a study with a fireplace. He hadn't stoked his own stove first. He'd started with the barracks, with the infirmary, with the smithy. His own room was last on the list. He hadn't gotten that far. He'd fallen asleep, on the stone. In the freezing cold, Celeste approached quietly. She took off her shawl, that very one she'd worn without taking off ever since she'd arrived. She draped it over his shoulders, and sat down beside him, silently, on the cold stone, next to the man who hadn't slept for a day so that the room where strangers' children lay would be warm. Margot saw this from around the corner. She stopped. She stood there for a moment. Then she left. Hana saw it from the pantry window. She turned away. She ran her hand over her face. She went back to her notebooks. Yuna saw it from the smithy. Silently, she took a piece of rag. She dampened it with warm water. She went out into the yard. She placed it next to Mercer, for his hands, when he wakes up, and she returned to the forge. Isabel saw it from the tower window. She stood there for a long time. Then she sat down at the table. She picked up a quill. She began to write. Not a letter, not a report. Something for herself. Mercer woke up 2 hours later. The shawl was on his shoulders. The wet rag was nearby. And Celeste was there too, asleep, leaning against a rock, frozen. He carefully removed the shawl from his shoulders, covered her with it, stood up, picked her up. She didn't weigh much. He carried her to the infirmary, laid her on a bench, covered her. She didn't wake up. Or maybe she did but didn't open her eyes. He went out, washed his face, wiped his hands with the rag Yuna had left behind, and went to work. Because the work was never ending. Because winter lay ahead. A long one, dark, and somewhere beyond the pass, an army that would arrive in the spring. That same day, more refugees arrived at the fortress, 12 people, 3 families, from 2 burned-down villages, carrying bundles, with children, with empty eyes. One of the women was carrying an infant. The baby wasn't crying. Celeste took him in her arms. She checked him. Alive. He'd just grown tired of crying. Dan took them all in, found them a place to stay. He gave them the last available rooms in the barracks. Hannah counted them. With the new arrivals, there were 43 people in the fortress. 12 soldiers on their feet, 5 sick, 3 beyond hope, 5 widows, 2 masons, 2 servants, a cook, a priest, and 16 refugees including 7 children. Food was running short. The balance that Hannah had maintained for 3 weeks collapsed in a single day. 16 new mouths to feed. 7 of them were children. You can't give children half rations. That evening, Dan sat with Hannah poring over her ledgers. She pointed out the numbers. Enough grain for 10 days. Salted meat for a week. The turnips are running out. Goat's milk is only for the children and the sick.
We need a breakthrough. We need food. A lot of it. Fast, Dan thought. Then he asked Hannah what was in the tunnels below. She looked at him blankly. He explained. The tunnels are warm. There's water. If there are mushrooms or underground plants, or even fish in an underground river, then they'd have a food source that doesn't depend on the weather or the season. Hannah raised an eyebrow. She said he was planning to feed people with whatever grows in the basement. Dan said that feeding people with what they have is better than not feeding them at all. Hannah was silent for a moment. She nodded. She made a note of it. The next day, Dan went down into the tunnels. Hannah went with him. He didn't want to take her. She insisted. She said that when it came to supplies, she had to see it with her own eyes. You can't count on something you haven't seen. The logic was flawless. He took her with him. They walked down the corridor to the room with the blueprints. Hannah stopped. She looked at the walls, at the blueprints. She was silent. For a long time. Then she said quietly that this changed everything. Dan nodded. They kept going. Through one of the passageways, they emerged into the next corridor. Already. Lower down. The air was warm and humid. After 200 steps, they found what he was looking for, an underground stream. Clear, fast-flowing. The water was warm from a geothermal spring, and mushrooms were growing on the rocks along the stream. White. Large. Entire colonies. Hannah crouched down. She touched one. Sniffed it. Looked at Mercer. She said that if these mushrooms were edible, there was enough food here for 100 people. Dan picked one. Broke it open. White flesh. It smelled like mushrooms. Clean. Not poisonous. He said they needed Celeste. She's a herbalist. She'll identify them. They filled a basket with mushrooms. They headed back up. Celeste looked at them, sniffed them, tasted a piece, waited an hour. Nothing happened. She boiled one mushroom, tasted the broth. Nothing happened. By evening, she said the mushrooms were edible, nutritious, safe. Dan told everyone not to say where they came from. He said he'd found them in the basement, in the old passageways. That was enough. Details later. All 43 people ate the mushroom soup that evening. Thick. Hot. The children ate greedily. The soldiers ate in silence. The cook grumbled that the mushrooms were strange but easy to cook. For the first time in a month, no one in the fortress went to bed hungry. By the end of the second month, 62 people were living in Ravenhold. Refugees arrived every week. In pairs. In groups of 5. 1 family. 2. The burned-out villages were spitting out people the way a sinking ship spits out debris. They headed toward the only place where smoke was rising. Toward the only walls still standing. Toward the only gates that closed. Dan took everyone in. Hannah counted them every time. Every time she shook her head. Every time she found a way. Mushrooms from the tunnels became the staple of their diet. Celeste taught the cook to prepare them in 6 different ways. The cook stopped trying to leave on foot. He had a job now. Among the refugees were some useful people. A carpenter, 2 shepherds with 3 goats, a leather worker, a woman who knew how to spin, and an old man who had been a first and knew how to build a handmill from 2 stones. Dan put everyone to work. The carpenter repaired the doors and shutters. The shepherd set up a pen for the goats by the south wall. The tanner began tanning hides for winter clothing. The spinner sat down at the spinning wheel in the barracks, and the thread began to flow. The miller built the millstones in the courtyard. Rough, small, but the grain was ground, flour was produced, bread was baked. Real bread for the first time in months.
When the first loaf came out of the oven and the cook broke it open in the courtyard, the smell of hot bread wafted through the fortress. One of the soldiers, one of that very same hopeless group of 5, was standing by the wall. He sniffed the air. His face twitched. He walked over to the cook. He asked for a piece. He took it. He ate it. He stood there for a moment. Then he went to Griff. He said he was ready to work. Griff silently handed him a shovel. The 4 hopeless ones became 3. Dan worked on the defenses, every day, for several hours. The pass, the throat, 3 echelons. The first echelon, a decoy camp, he had already begun building. He sent 5 soldiers with Margot. They set up tents, old ones, tattered ones. They set up fire pits, left traces behind. From a distance, the camp looked like an outpost. Margot arranged things so that reconnaissance would see signs of life. Mess kits, ropes for drying clothes, an old shield leaning against a rock. No one inside. But from the outside, it looked alive. The second echelon was in the throat. Dan began working on the collapse. He had to remove keystones from the right wall, discreetly, so that the wall would hold. But barely, on a single prop, one that could be knocked out with a lever from the lower tunnel. He worked at night, alone, in the dark, with a torch and a chisel, stone by stone. He chiseled them out, replaced them with wooden wedges. From the outside, the wall looked the same as before. Inside, it hung on temporary supports like a tooth held by a single root. Margot knew. No one else did. The third line of defense against the approaches to the fortress. People were needed here. Dan trained the soldiers. He showed them how to dig a wolf pit, how to camouflage it, how to set up a tripwire using rope and a weight, how to create a false trail leading into the line of fire. The soldiers listened. Not all of them understood, but Griff did. 30 years of service. He'd seen traps, but he hadn't seen the system. Mercer provided the system. Every pit in its place, every tripwire in its sector. Every false turn leads to where the crossbowman is standing, not by chance, according to plan. After one of these training sessions, Griff approached Mercer. He said quietly that in 30 years, he had served under 11 commanders. Not a single one thought that way. Dan said it wasn't about him. The point was that they didn't think that way here, and he'd learned it somewhere else. Griff asked where. Dan paused. He said it was far away. Griff didn't press him for details. He nodded. And for the first time ever, he didn't call him Baron or Your Grace. He called him Commander, quietly, without fanfare, just as a soldier addresses the man he's ready to follow. Dan heard it. He said nothing, but inside, something shifted. In his past life, that's what those who followed him into a minefield had called him. Here, it was said by a man who, 3 months ago, hadn't believed he'd live to see spring. Rowena Talbot arrived at the end of the 2nd month. Not a refugee, not a widow, the younger sister of one of the fallen officers, 19 years old, petite, a redhead, with a bag stuffed with papers and pencils. She came because she had nowhere else to go. Her brother was killed. Her parents had died before the war. Her aunt in the capital had given up the family home when it became clear that the Talbot name no longer brought any benefit. Someone in the capital told her that Baron Mercer lived in Ravenhold, and that he took in those who had nowhere else to go. She arrived on a passing wagon. She walked through the gate. She stood in the middle of the courtyard. With her bag, she looked around. Dan approached. He asked who she was. She introduced herself. She said she knew how to draw maps, nothing else of use. Dan looked at her. He asked if she could draw a map of the pass, with elevations, with distances, with terrain features. Rowena opened her bag. She took out a sheet of paper, unfolded it, a map of the pass, already drawn, along the way, from memory, with elevations she'd estimated by eye, with distances she'd measured in steps. Dan took the map. He looked at it, for a long time. The map was accurate, not perfect, but for work done on the fly without tools, it was impressive. He looked at Rowena. He said that starting today, she was the Mark's chief cartographer. Rowena blinked. She asked if he was joking. Dan said no. He needed maps. Accurate ones. Detailed ones. Of the passes, the gorges, the surrounding areas, approaches to the fortress. If she could draw like that on the fly, then with tools and time, she'd be able to create something no one else in this kingdom had. A proper military map. Rowena stood there. She looked at him. Her eyes were wide. No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever given her a title. even if it was unofficial, even if it was in a fortress at the edge of the world. But a title. And the man who had given it to her was looking at her seriously, without condescension, without a smile, as if she were a professional. She nodded. She said she needed a table, and light, and access to the wall. Dan didn't understand. Which wall? Rowena said the fortress wall. She needed to see the terrain from above, every day, at different times. The light changes the terrain. In the morning, the shadows show one thing, in the evening, something else. She would draw from morning until night, and by the end of the week, he would have a map he could use to wage war. Dan nodded. He gave her a room in the tower, a table, candles, paper from Isabel's supplies, and access to the wall at any time. Rowena began working that very day, quietly, intently, with a stylus that never left the paper. Isabel watched her from her window. That evening, she told Mercer that the girl drew better than the royal cartographers. Dan said he knew. That was exactly why she was here. 2 months, 62 people. The gates, the walls, the roof, water, heat, food, the smithy, maps, the defense plan, 3 echelons, tunnels beneath their feet, a secret in the stone, the enemy beyond the pass, the enemy in the capital, and 6 women, each in her place, each irreplaceable. Celeste healed, Hannah calculated, Margot defended, Isabel thought, Una forged, Rowena painted. And he stood on the wall, gazing at the pass. An army was gathering beyond the mountains. He knew it. He could feel it, just as he could smell gunpowder a second before an explosion. Spring would come, and with it, they would come. But he would be ready, because he was always ready. Because a sapper who isn't ready is a dead sapper. And he had already died once. Enough. The 3rd month. Winter was gnawing at the mountains, but inside Ravenhold it was warm. Stoves with reversible chimneys kept the heat in. The coal seam provided fuel. Mushrooms from the tunnels provided food. Bread from the old man's mill was baked every morning. The fortress breathed. It lived. It grew. Dan counted the people. 78. Newcomers arrived every week. The rumor spread through the borderlands like wildfire through dry grass. Ravenhold takes people in. Ravenhold feeds them. In Ravenhold, the walls stand and the gates are shut. For people who had lost their homes, that meant everything. Among the new arrivals were 3 former soldiers, deserters from collapsed garrisons. Griff looked them over. He told Mercer that 2 were fit for service. The 3rd was drunk and dangerous. Dan spoke with the 3rd man, a man named Cole. His eyes were empty. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from what was inside him. Dan recognized that look. He'd seen it in the mirror, in his past life. After the 3rd round. When he'd dream of the bridge every night, even though the bridge didn't exist yet. There were other bridges, other charges, other shouts over the radio. He told Cole he wouldn't turn him away. He gave him a job, a simple one, carrying water to the filter. Not because there was no one else to do it, because work keeps you grounded. When your hands are busy, your mind is quiet. Cole grabbed a bucket. He set off. After a week, his hands stopped shaking. After 2 weeks, he asked Griff for a place in the ranks. Griff gave it to him. The garrison had grown to 25 combat-ready soldiers. Not an army, but no longer just a handful. Margot trained them every day. Drill, sword, shield, spear, crossbow. Una forged 12 new crossbow mechanisms with her spring-loaded trigger. Reloading was a 3rd faster. Margot tried one. She looked at Una. She said this thing was worth 10 soldiers. Una nodded, without a smile, but her eyes sparkled. Rowena finished the 1st complete map. The pass, the gorge, the throat, the approaches to the fortress, elevations, distances, dead zones, firing sectors. Dan spread the map out on the table. He studied it. An hour. 2. He traced his finger along the lines. Every turn in the trail. Every rock you could take cover behind. Every vantage point, where you could see and where you couldn't. Then he looked up at Rowena. He said it was the best map he'd ever seen in his life,
and that he'd seen a lot of maps. Rowena blushed to her ears. She said she could do better, if he gave her another week. Dan said he had a week, but she should start on the second map, the one of the tunnels. She looked at him and asked which tunnels. He led her downstairs and showed her the room with the blueprints. Rowena stood in the middle of the room, turning her head from side to side. Her eyes were wide, her mouth agape. She ran her fingers along the walls. She ran her fingers along the lines of the blueprints. She whispered something. Then she turned to Mercer. She said it was impossible, that no cartographer in the kingdom possessed such precision, that these blueprints were made by people who knew things about stone and water that no one knows now. Dan said he knew. That's exactly why she needed to sketch it. Everything. Every drawing. Every symbol. Every line. Rowena nodded. She sat down on the floor right there in the tunnel. She took out some paper. She began to draw. She drew for 3 days. She went down in the morning. She came back up at night. She ate down there. Hannah brought her food. Silently, without asking questions. On the 4th day, Rowena came up with a thick stack of sheets. She laid them out in front of Mercer, a copy of every drawing from the hall, including the map of the tunnels. Dan laid out the map of the tunnels next to Rowena's map of the surface. He aligned them, and he saw what changed everything. The tunnels emerged to the surface at 5 points. One beneath the fortress, one in the gorge beyond the pass, one on the mountainside above the pass, one by the river south of the fortress, and one, far to the east, in the direction of the capital. 5 exits, 5 points through which one could appear anywhere, unnoticed, at any time. An army that controls these tunnels controls more than just the pass. It controls the entire space between the mountains and the plain. Dan sat poring over the maps until dawn. Then he called Margot over. He showed her. She looked, for a long time. Then she looked up. She said quietly that if the exit into the gorge was passable, she could lead the squad behind the lines of any army that entered the gorge. Strike from behind, when they're already trapped. When a landslide cuts them off from the front. A strike from 2 sides, stone and steel. Dan nodded. He said that was exactly right. Margot sat down. She looked at her hands, then at him. She said that Drakemont fell because they had nothing but walls and people. Here there are walls. There are people. And there is something that no one else has. An underground world older than all the kingdoms. She paused. Then she said that her husband had died covering the retreat from a fortress that couldn't be held. It would be different here. Here, it could be held, and she would hold it. She laid her sword on his table. She said that now it was his, according to the rules. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were dry. But the hand that placed the sword there trembled slightly. Dan picked up the sword. He put it back. He said she needed the sword more. He wasn't a warrior. He was an engineer. His weapons lay on the table, paper and a stylus. Margot took the sword. For the first time ever, she smiled. A real smile. Not a mean one. Not a bitter one. A warm one. She said he was the strangest commander she'd ever met. Dan said he was the strangest commander he'd ever met himself. Margot snorted and left. She turned around on the stairs. She said that if he died, she would kill him. Dan said he'd remember that. Spring arrived all at once. The snow didn't melt gradually. It collapsed. A warm wind from the south swept into the mountains, and within 3 days, the white turned to gray. The streams roared. The river beneath the southern wall swelled and thundered. The ice on the pass cracked. The road opened up. And with it, time opened up. Dan stood on the wall and looked at the pass. Rowena stood beside him. She pointed on the map. Here's the gorge. Here's the false camp. Here are the crossbowmen's positions on the upper ridges. Here's the point of the landslide. Here's the tunnel exit into the gorge beyond the throat. Everything's in place. Everything's ready. Almost. Dan went down to the courtyard. He gathered the council. For the first time, he called it that. The council. 6 women. Griff. Everyone was in the commandant's office, which in 4 months had transformed from an empty stone cell into a working office. On the walls were Rowena's maps. On the table were Hannah's notebooks. In the corner stood a rack with Yuna's crossbow. Above the fireplace were bundles of Celesta's herbs. On the windowsill was a stack of letters written in Isabel's hand. Dan spoke briefly. Waldorn would come. The question wasn't whether he would come, but when and how many. By his calculations, they had a month. Maybe a month and a half. Until the roads dried out. Until the army assembled. Until the supply trains reached the pass. Everything must be finished within that month. He assigned tasks, not orders, tasks. Margot, the garrison, training. Every day, until exhaustion. 25 fighters must work like 50. Formation. Retreat. Reorganization. Firing from elevated positions. Retreat through the tunnels. Una. Weapons. 20 more crossbow mechanisms. Bolts. As many as she can manage. Arrowheads. Steel. Made from new coal iron. Kana. Supplies. Food for a 3-month siege. Water. Coal. Bandages. Arrows. Count everything. Sort everything out. Know everything by heart. Celeste. Infirmary. Expand it. Prepare tables. Instruments. Clean water. Alcohol. The distillation still he promised her in the first week, and which Una forged a month ago, has already yielded its first liters. Decoctions. Bandages. Everything that will be needed when they start bringing in the wounded. Isabel. Letters. 3. To the king. To the neighboring barons. And to Lord Chancellor Waldorn. Each with its own calculation, each at its own time. Write to the king after the first skirmish. Not before. After. When there's something to report, when the word Mercer means victory, not exile. Write to the neighboring barons now. Carefully. Don't ask for help. Warn them. Waldorn is coming. Those who want to live will think. Those who don't want to think shouldn't complain later. Write to Chancellor Verne personally. Not a threat, not a plea. A fact. The pass is closed. The price of entry is high. Decide for yourselves. Rowena. Maps. Update them. Refine them. Check every exit from the tunnels and mark everything you see on the map. Every stone. Every bush. Every shadow. Rowena nodded. Her eyes were ablaze. For the first time in her life, she was needed. For real. Not as a girl. As a specialist. The council dispersed. Everyone went about their business. Dan was left alone. He sat down at the table, closed his eyes. A flash. A bridge. A river. The smell of gunpowder. A shout over the radio. Stand back! He opened his eyes, stood up, went down to the underground chamber. He needed to finish one job. The lever. The collapse mechanism at the mouth of the tunnel was ready from above. The rocks had been cleared away. The supports were in place. But the lever down below had to be connected to the supports via a system of cables. Ropes wouldn't work. They'd rot, get wet, stretch out. He needed a chain. He went to Una. Told her he needed a chain. A long one, a strong one, 80 links. Una asked what it was for. He paused. Then he said it was so that when he pulled on one end, the mountain would come crashing down at the other end. Una looked at him. For a long time. Then she said quietly that he wasn't Baron Mercer. Dan didn't answer. Una said she'd been forging weapons since she was 12. She knows hands accustomed to metal and hands accustomed to paper. His hands are accustomed to earth, to stone, to wires. He picks up a tool like a man who's spent his life taking things apart. Not putting them together, taking them apart. She doesn't know who he is. But he isn't a court-martial who's spent his whole life in the capital. Dan was silent. Then he said she was right. He isn't who he seems to be, but he is the one standing between these walls and whatever comes over the pass. And right now he needs a chain. Una nodded. She said the chain would be ready, and that she didn't care who he was. What mattered to her was what he was doing. She turned away toward the forge. Then, without turning back, she said one more thing. She said her husband had been a good man. She hadn't loved him, but he'd been a good man. He'd died, and she'd felt relief, and hated herself for it for 2 years. Then she came here, and she stopped hating herself, because there's no time for that here. Because here, she has to forge. Because here, for the first time in her life, what she does with her hands matters. She paused. Then she said that a living person has the right to feel what they feel. A dead person doesn't anymore. Dan recognized his own words. He'd said them to her a month ago. She'd remembered them, word for word. He didn't say anything. He went outside.
He stood in the doorway of the forge and listened to the hammer striking the anvil, link by link, a chain that would bring down a mountain.
Forged by the hands of a woman who, for the first time in 2 years, was sleeping without a knife under her pillow. He went to his room. He lay down. He closed his eyes. And for the first time in 4 months in this world, he didn't dream of a bridge. They arrived 5 weeks after the snow melted. 3,000. Not 5, as he'd expected by fall. 3. The Vanguard, a test force. 1 battle mage. Dan found out about this from Wheeler. The old man had sent his grandson. The boy ran up at dawn, gasping for breath. He said the army was coming. He'd seen them from the hill, Waldorn's banners, cavalry in the lead, infantry following, a supply train, a long one. Dan mobilized the fortress. No shouting, no panic. Griff walked through the barracks, quietly. He tapped each man on the shoulder. The soldiers stood up, got dressed, grabbed their weapons, silently, just as they'd been taught. 4 months of training, 4 months of work. Now it would all either pay off or it wouldn't. Dan called a final council meeting, quickly, briefly. Margot is taking 15 fighters and heading to the upper positions at the pass. Crossbowmen. Roven marked their positions on a separate map, every point, every firing sector, every retreat route. Una is going with Margot. The crossbows are loaded. The bolts have been counted. Hannah stays in the fortress. She counts. She distributes. She makes sure that not a single crossbowman is left without a supply for even a minute. The supply runners know their routes. Celeste is setting up the infirmary. The tables are ready. The water is boiling. The instruments are clean. There's alcohol. The bandages are cut. She's as ready. Isabel sits in the rear tower. 3 letters lie before her. Sealed. Addressed. 3 messengers are waiting by the back entrance. Each letter will be sent at the right moment. Rowena is on the wall, with a spyglass that Una assembled from 2 old lenses found in the basement and a copper tube. Crooked. Blurry. But it works. Rowena guides the signalers. 3 dots on the slope. Flags. Red means they're advancing. Blue means they're retreating. White means a mage. Dan descends into the dungeon, alone. He walks through the tunnel, past the hall with the blueprints, past the underground stream, to the fork, left toward the collapse lever. Una's chain glints in the torchlight. 80 links. Each one has been checked. Each one will hold. He walks to the end. The lever, wooden, set into a stone socket. The chain runs from it upward through the shaft to the struts in the right wall of the throat. 1 tug, and the struts are knocked out, and the wall falls. 300 metric tons of rock, maybe 500. He places his hand on the lever, cold, smooth, wood polished by his palms during weeks of preparation. He waits. Up above, it begins. Waldorn's army enters the foothills, cavalry in the lead. They find a decoy camp. They stop. The scouts dismount. They enter the camp. Empty. Tents, fire pits, an old shield. No one there. A trap or a retreat. The commander decides it's a retreat. The garrison of 15 ragged soldiers saw the army and fled. Logical, expected. They press on. They enter the gorge. Infantry, heavy infantry, in formation, shields, spears, a banner at the front. The gorge is narrow. The formation breaks. 4 paces wide, 2 side by side. The column stretches out. 300 meters of a living snake in a stone corridor. Margot waits. She counts. When the lead unit passes the middle of the gorge, she raises her hand. The crossbowmen on the upper ledges stand up. 15 men, 30 crossbows, 2 per man. A Ewan lock. Reload time. 8 seconds instead of 12. The first volley strikes the officers. Margot taught them to aim for the commanders. Take off the head, and the body doesn't know where to go. Bolts whistle. From top to bottom. In the narrow pass, there's no way to dodge. No way to raise a shield. Shields block what's in front, not what's above. The first volley takes down 8. 3 officers. The column comes to a halt. Shouts. Orders. But there's no one left to give them. The officers are on the ground. A second volley. 6 more. A third. The infantry breaks. Those in the rear press forward. Those in the front try to retreat. A stampede. Within a space 4 paces wide, the stampede kills faster than the bolts. A battle mage. He's in the center of the column. He raises his hands. Fire. A ball of flame flies upward toward the edge. Margot shouts a command. The crossbowmen roll back behind the stones. The fire strikes empty air. The stone turns black, but the men are unharmed. Mercer waits.
His hand is on the lever. Rowena on the fortress wall sees the mage's fire. She raises a white flag. A signalman on the slope repeats the signal. A second signalman repeats it further away. A third stands above the shaft leading to Mercer. He shouts down, "Mage!" Mercer hears him. He waits. He counts. The mage is in the center of the column. The center of the column is in the middle of the gorge, directly above the collapse point. Now, he pulls the lever. The chain tightens. The links grind. Up above, the struts fly out with a dry crack. The right wall of the gully holds for a second, 2, 3. Then it starts to move. Slowly, then faster. Then with a roar that drowns out everything. 300 metric tons of shale crash into the shaft. Dust. A rumble. The ground shakes. Dan feels the rock tremble beneath his feet, feels the dust hitting his face from the mine, feels the torch go out. Darkness. Silence. Then a sound. Distant. Muffled by rock. A scream. Many screams. And then silence again. He stands in the darkness, his hand on the lever in the lower position. That's it. It worked. He lights a second torch. He heads for the exit into the gorge beyond the chasm, the very same exit that Rowena found on the map. Margot is already there, with 10 fighters. They made their way out through the tunnel, while the gorge was collapsing. They emerged behind those who remained on the other side of the rubble, those who hadn't entered the gorge. The supply train, the rear guard. Those who now stand staring at the stone wall where, a minute ago, there had been a passage. Margot isn't waiting. A strike from the tunnel, into their backs, into panic, into chaos. 10 fighters against a disoriented rear guard. This isn't a battle, it's a rout. The rear guard flees. The supply train is abandoned. The cavalry that was ahead has already galloped off to scout the false camp. They'll return to find the blocked passage and an empty road. The battle lasts an hour. Then it's all over. Mercer climbs up, through the tunnel, through the underground passage, up the stairs. He steps out into the courtyard, black with dust. His cheek is scorched by the hot air from the mine. His left ear is deaf. Deafness from the roar. The courtyard is silent. People are standing there. They're watching. They heard the roar. They felt the earth shake. They saw the pillar of dust rising above the mountains. And now they're looking at the man who emerged from beneath the earth. Margot returns through the gate. Her sword is covered in blood. She holds her helmet in her hand. She takes it off silently. Hannah stands there holding the signs. She drops them. The slate rolls across the stones. Celeste takes a step away from the infirmary door, then a second. Una lowers the crossbow she'd been holding at the ready the whole time. She'd been standing by the embrasure, waiting, ready to shoot if anyone broke through. No one broke through. Isabel stands in the tower doorway. 3 letters have been sent. The messengers left during the first hour of the battle. She looks at Mercer. For the first time ever, she is at a loss for words. Rowena stands on the wall, a spyglass in her hand. She speaks quietly. He's back. Mercer surveys the courtyard. He counts. Everyone is alive. Casualties. 2 wounded. 1 crossbowman fell from the cliff. He broke his leg. Celeste is already on her way to him. The second was cut by a rock, a shard from the landslide. Not fatal. 2. Of the 3,000 who set out for the pass, about 1,000 are left in the mountain gorge, buried under the rocks, forever. The rest fled. Along with the mage, if the mage survived. Dan stands in the courtyard. He wipes soot from his face and speaks hoarsely, matter-of-factly, like a report after a shift. That's it. The area has been cleared. A week has passed since the battle. Ravenhold was silent, but the world around him was buzzing. The first to arrive was a letter from Lord Chancellor Verne. Isabel brought it to Mercer. The envelope was heavy, an official seal, not a personal one, official. Verne wrote in a restrained tone. He congratulated him on the fact that the Baron had proved stronger than expected. He reported that the loss of the vanguard was an inconvenience, but not a catastrophe. Waldorn still had 5,000 men, and 2 mages, and siege weapons. But at the end of the letter, the tone changed. Verne wrote that he didn't understand how it had been done. His intelligence had reported 15 stragglers in a crumbling fortress. But the reality turned out to be different. He wanted to understand it. And he proposed a meeting, a private one, on neutral ground. If the Baron has no objection,
Dan read it twice. He showed it to Isabel. She read it. She said that Vern was smart. He wasn't making threats. He was testing the waters. He wanted to understand who he was dealing with, because his worldview had just been shattered. 3,000 hadn't returned. The pass was blocked. The mountain pass was closed. And it was done by a man whom the court considers an exiled old man. Dan asked what she thought about the meeting. Isabel paused. She said that meeting him was dangerous, but not meeting him was even more dangerous. Vern would conclude that Mercer was afraid, and Vern respects only those he cannot intimidate. Dan nodded. He sat down at the table. He wrote the reply himself, without Isabel's help. She read it. She raised an eyebrow. She said it was a bit rough, but it would do for a soldier. Dan said that's exactly what he was, a soldier. Isabel corrected 3 words. She removed one, she added another. The letter became perfect. Vern's reply was brief. Mercer thanked him for his interest. He reported that he wasn't tired of his king. He was tired of people who thought the border could be taken by sheer numbers. If the chancellor wanted to see for himself, he could come again. He neither accepted nor rejected the meeting. Time would tell. A second letter arrived from the capital. Not from the king, from Lord Kastner, the first counselor, the man who had arranged the exile. The letter was icy. Kastner expressed surprise that Baron Mercer was engaging in military activity that had not been authorized by the court. He reminded him that Ravenhold was a place of exile, not a military outpost. He demanded a detailed report on all actions taken without the crown's approval. And between the lines, he hinted that excessive initiative on the border could be interpreted as preparation for a rebellion. Dan read it. His expression didn't change. He passed it to Isabel. She read it. She said that Kastner was in a panic. Not because of Waldorn, because Mercer was alive and active. For 20 years, Kastner had kept Ravenhold dead. A poisoned well. A curse. Garrisons that perished one after another. All of that was his doing. Through frontmen. Through agents. He couldn't let anyone go down into the dungeons and find the tunnels. Because the tunnels led to the capital. And whoever controls the tunnels holds power independent of the royal seal. Dan asked if Kastner knew that the tunnels led to the capital. Isabel said it was almost certain. That was exactly why he kept the fortress empty. Not out of loyalty to the crown, but out of fear. If someone else found the way, Kastner would lose his monopoly on this secret, and perhaps his head as well. Dan sat and thought. 2 enemies, Waldorn on the outside, Kastner on the inside. One is coming with an army, the other with letters and poison. Which is more dangerous? He knew the answer, the one closer to his back. The third letter was from the king, short, dry. The king had taken note of Baron Mercer's report on repelling the enemy's sortie at the border. He thanked him for his service, and he announced that he was sending an authorized representative to Ravenhold to assess the situation. Isabel read the king's letter 3 times. Then she said, "This isn't Kastner, it's the king himself." The wording was different. The king's interest was piqued. An exiled baron had repelled 3,000. That didn't fit any pattern. The king wanted to see it with his own eyes, or through the eyes of someone he trusted. Not Kastner, someone of his own. Dan asked if that was good or bad. Isabel said it depended on who they sent. If it was the king's man, it was an opportunity. If it was Kastner's man posing as the king's man, it was a trap. They'd know when they saw him. Dan nodded. He went back to work. The pass was blocked. The mountain pass was closed. But not forever. Waldorn would clear it or find a detour. Time again. He made the most of every day. Refugees kept coming. By the end of the 5th month, 200 people were living in Ravenhold. 200. A village within the walls. No, a small town. The smithy was running 2 shifts. Una took on an apprentice, a boy from among the refugees, 14 years old. Strong hands, a keen eye. She taught him just as her father had taught her, in silence, by demonstration. The boy picked it up in a flash. Celeste expanded the infirmary. 2 rooms, clean, warm. Running water from a Mercer filter flowed through a wooden trough straight to the table. A distillation still produced alcohol. Under her direction, the blacksmith forged real surgical instruments for her. Clamps, needles, scalpels.
Precision work. Una's work. The first wounded man Celeste treated in this infirmary was a crossbowman with a broken leg. She set the bone, applied a splint, rinsed the wound with alcohol, bandaged it with a clean bandage. He survived. The leg healed. A month later, he was walking. When he got to his feet and took his first step across the courtyard, Celeste stood in the doorway of the infirmary and watched. Then she went back inside. She sat down in a corner and sat there for a long time, in silence, her hands on her knees, motionless for the first time in 15 years. She didn't cry, or maybe she did. The door was closed. No one saw her, but when she came out, her eyes were red, and she was smiling. For the first time, the school opened at the beginning of the 6th month. One of the widows, no, not a widow anymore, Isabel. She began teaching the children to read, not on orders, of her own accord. One morning, Dan walked past a room on the first floor of the tower and heard children's voices. He peeked inside. Isabel was sitting on a stool. 7 children were on the floor around her. She was holding a stick and tracing letters on a slate that a carpenter had put together. The children repeated them, clumsily, loudly, happily. Isabel noticed Mercer in the doorway. She raised an eyebrow. She said that if he said even one word, she'd stop. Dan didn't say anything. He nodded. He left. He stopped on the stairs, leaned against the wall, closed his eyes. Children's voices. In the fortress that 4 months ago had been considered cursed, children's voices. He stood there for a minute. Then he went to work. A wedding took place in the chapel, the first one. Not Mercer's. Soldier Cole, the very one who'd arrived with trembling hands and empty eyes, married a woman from among the refugees. A quiet one. A reserved one. They'd found each other in the fortress, both broken, both mended. Not completely, but enough to give it a try. Bernard officiated the ceremony, silently, without joy. He still considered Mercer an imposter and everything happening in the fortress a rebellion against the natural order of things. But he performed the ceremony, because even he couldn't refuse 2 people who wanted to be together. After the wedding, Dan stood in the courtyard. Evening. Warm. The first truly warm evening. Spring was turning into summer. The courtyard was full of people, light streaming from the windows, laughter from the barracks, the clang of a hammer from the smithy, the smell of bread from the kitchen, a child's cry from somewhere above, and music. Isabel had found an old clavichord in the tower. She'd repaired it, tuned it, and played it. The sound floated over the courtyard, delicate, pure, sad and warm at the same time. Dan listened. And he thought about how 4 months ago there had been nothing but dead stone in this very spot. Poisoned water, rotting walls, 20 people waiting to die. And now there were 200 people living here. He hadn't built a fortress. He had built a home. The border had formed on its own. A royal envoy arrived at the beginning of summer, not alone, with an escort of 30 horsemen, the banners of the royal house, armor, spears. Dan stood on the wall and watched as they rode up the road toward the gate. Margot stood beside him, her hand on her sword, her eyes counting the horsemen. Dan said it wasn't necessary. They weren't the enemy. Margot said that until she saw the face of the visitor, she wouldn't take her hand off her sword. The gate opened. The horsemen rode into the courtyard, and Dan saw who had arrived. Not an official, not an inspector, Duke Alden Crane, Marshal of the Royal Army. Second in the military hierarchy only to the king. An old friend of Baron Mercer, the real Mercer, the one who died at the table while reading the decree of exile. Isabel turned pale. She whispered to Mercer that Crane had known the old Baron personally. 30 years. If anyone were to notice the switch, it would be him. Dan nodded. He went down into the courtyard. Crane was dismounting. Tall, gray-haired, straight as a spear, a scar across his left cheek, sharp eyes. He stood in the middle of the courtyard and looked. At the walls, at the gate, at the smoke from the smithy, at the people moving about the courtyard, at the children peeking out from behind the corner of the barracks, at the woman with a stylus behind her ear who was standing by the storeroom, counting sacks, at another woman with a sword who was watching him from atop the wall, her hand never leaving the hilt. Then he looked at Mercer. For a long time, his expression didn't change. Dan approached. He bowed as Isabel had taught him, not too low, not too shallow, as an equal. A baron greets a duke. Crane watched him. Then he said quietly that the Everett Mercer he'd known for 30 years was an old man with a bad back and trembling hands. And standing before him was a man of about 40, with a straight back and hands calloused from a pickaxe. Dan said that the frontier heals. Crane didn't smile. He said that the frontier doesn't make you 20 years younger. Dan was silent. Crane was silent. The courtyard was silent. Then Crane said that it didn't matter to him who was standing before him, because he'd traveled for 3 weeks to see the fortress that had stopped 3,000, and he was seeing it. And what he was seeing was impossible. A poisoned well that still works, walls that still stand, a garrison that obeys orders, a forge that forges, an infirmary, a school, children, and a past that's been blocked off so neatly that his engineers can't explain how it was done. He said the king had sent him with 2 questions. First, who are you? Second, what do you want? Dan looked him in the eye. He said he was Everett Mercer, Commandant of Ravenhold. That's enough for the first question. The answer to the second is simple. He wants the border to survive. He wants the people behind these walls to be safe. For an engineer to mean more than a family lineage. For a widow to have a name and not be treated as property. For a peasant from a burned-down village to know he won't be betrayed. He doesn't want the crown. He doesn't want a title. He doesn't want to return to the capital. He wants the right to tell the king to his face, "Here is the border. It is mine. Come in as a guest." Crane listened, his face stony. Then he nodded. He said he would pass on the message, word for word. He stayed for 3 days. Dan showed him everything. The walls, the gates, the water filtration system, the furnaces with recirculating flues, the smithy, the infirmary, Una's crossbows, Rowena's maps, Hana's notebooks, the positions at the pass, the decoy camp, the remains of the gorge. He didn't show him one thing, the tunnels. Not yet. Crane walked around. He looked. He touched the walls. He checked the mortar. He picked up Una's crossbow. He took aim. He fired. He examined the mechanism. He turned to Una. He said he wanted to order 500 of them for the royal army. Una looked at Mercer. Mercer nodded. Una said she could forge 50 a month if they gave her 2 more apprentices. Crane said he'd send them. The next day, Crane asked to see the infirmary. Celeste showed him around. In silence, she pointed out the tables, the instruments, the alcohol, and the water. Bandages. Crane looked around. Then he said that in 30 years of service, he'd never seen a field infirmary better than this one. Not in a single fortress. Not in a single garrison. Celeste said it wasn't about her. It was because of the man who built her the walls and gave her water and instruments. She only heals. He gave her the means to heal. Crane looked at her. Then at Mercer. He said nothing. On the 3rd day before leaving, Crane asked to speak with her in private. They stood on the wall. Morning. Mountains. Sun. A warm breeze. Crane said he'd brought one more thing with him. Not from the king, from himself. He pulled a scroll from his bosom. Old. Worn. He handed it to Mercer. Dan unrolled it. It was a map. Old. Very old. Ravenhold was on it. But not as it is now. An ancient one. And beneath it, tunnels. Those very ones. Drawn by a different hand, with a different stylus. But those very same ones. Crane said this map had been lying in the royal archives for 300 years. He found it by chance while searching for documents on the border fortresses. And he realized something. He realized why Kastner had kept Ravenhold empty for 20 years. Kastner knows about the tunnels. But he doesn't know where they lead. He's afraid. Crane knows. Because this map shows the end of the eastern tunnel. The tunnel emerges beneath an old castle 3 hours from the capital, a castle that belongs to the Kastner family. That's the crux of the matter. Kastner isn't guarding a secret of the crown. He's guarding his own secret. For 3 centuries, his family has been stationed at the tunnel's exit. And for 3 centuries, they've done everything to prevent anyone from entering from the other side. Because if anyone does enter, the Kastners will lose their most important asset, their monopoly on the secret route between the border and the capital. Dan looked at the map. It all added up. The poisoned well, dead garrisons, a curse that was actually a job, all to ensure no one would go down and find the path leading to Kastner's castle. Crane said he would report everything he'd seen to the king. And the map. Kastner would answer for 20 years of sabotage at the border, for the dead garrisons, for the poisoned wells, for the betrayal he covered up with talk of loyalty.
Dan said he wasn't seeking revenge. Crane said this wasn't revenge. It was justice. Mercer nodded. Crane held out his hand. Dan shook it. Crane's hand was heavy, old, strong. Crane said one last thing. He said he didn't know who the man standing before him was. Not the old Baron, that much was certain. But whoever he was, he had done what no commandant had done in 50 years. He had breathed life into a dead place, and Crane would remember. The escort left in the morning. 30 horsemen, dust on the road. Dan stood on the wall and watched them ride away. Isabel stood beside him. She said that Kastner would fall. Maybe not right away, but he would fall. Because now the king knows, and the king does not forgive betrayal. Dan nodded. He said that by one less. Isabel said that Valdorn remains. Dan looked at the pass, at the mountains, at the gorge he had blocked. He said that Valdorn will remain forever. Borders don't disappear, but fortresses stand, if they're repaired. Isabel looked at him. She said quietly that he was a strange man. Dan said he knew. She almost smiled, almost. That evening, he went down into the dungeon, alone, with a torch. He walked through the tunnel, past the hall with the blueprints, further on, deeper, to a place he hadn't been before. The second level. The tunnel narrowed, lower. The air was warm, damp. It smelled of stone and water. After 300 steps, he found a room, a small one. The walls were smooth, and on the walls were blueprints, not of water pipes, not of bridges, other things. A demining diagram. He held the torch closer. A diagram. That very one. The one he'd drawn in training 12 years ago. The same symbols, the same lines, the same mistake in the upper right corner. The one his instructor had corrected for him. Staff Sergeant Novak, with a red pencil. Here the correction had been made with a different tool, but in the same spot, in the same way. Someone had already walked this path before him. Someone from his world. Or from a world so similar that the difference didn't matter. That someone had come down here, carved what they knew into the wall, and left clues for whoever would follow. Dan stood in front of the wall. The torch trembled in his hand. Not out of fear, out of recognition. He placed his palm on the diagram, traced the lines with his finger, found a mistake, and traced the correction with his finger. The very one that Novak had shown him. A line in the stone. Thin, but visible. A correction, a fix. The passing of knowledge from one sapper to another, across centuries, across worlds, through death and rebirth in a stranger's body. He stood in the silence of the dungeon, his hand on the wall, and he understood. His arrival here was no accident. Someone had walked this path before him, built it, taught him, left traces, and left, just as sappers leave after their work is done, quietly, without looking back, knowing that the next one would understand. Dan removed his hand, straightened up, stood there for another minute, then turned around and headed upstairs, toward the light, toward the people, toward the fortress that stood because someone had once decided it would stand. He stepped into the courtyard. Night, stars, a warm breeze from the mountains, laughter drifted from the barracks, the clang of hammering from the smithy, music from the tower. Isabel was playing the clavichord, softly, just for herself. Celeste was sitting by the well, sorting through herbs, her hands as always in motion. She looked up. She looked at him. He was dirty, as usual, black with underground dust. She said nothing. She moved over. He sat down beside her. She poured him a mug of hot herbal tea. He took it, took a sip. Hot, bitter, alive. They sat in silence, the two of them. By the well that had been poisoned 4 months ago, in the fortress that had been dead 4 months ago, under the stars that shone the same over all worlds. Celeste quietly asked if he'd found what he was looking for. Dan thought for a moment. He said he had. He'd found that someone had been here before him and had left him a job. Celeste nodded, as if it were only natural, as if people found messages from other worlds in basements every day. She said that having a job was a good thing. As long as there's work, there's a reason to get up in the morning. Dan looked at her calm face, at her hands, which were always busy with something, at the shawl she'd once wrapped around him on that freezing rock. He said yes, as long as there's work, and as long as there's someone to do it for. Celeste didn't answer, but she didn't pull away either. They sat like that until the stars began to fade, until the horizon beyond the mountains turned gray, until the first ray of light fell on Ravenhold's wall and the stone turned golden. Morning. A new day. Dan stood up. He brushed off his hands. He looked at the fortress.
at the walls that stood, at the gates that were closing, at the smoke rising from the chimneys, at the people who were beginning to wake up. 200 people, 6 women, 1 sapper, and a fortress at the edge of the world that had become his home. He didn't feel like a baron. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like the person he'd always been. A man who goes where it's scary, who dismantles what someone else has booby-trapped, and makes sure that life can go on after he's gone. He adjusted his collar, a stranger's, yet already familiar, and went to work. Because the wall in the northwest corner had sagged half a finger's width after yesterday's rain, and it needed to be repaired before breakfast.